I am Naomi, 36 years old, and I was speeding down Peachtree Road with a secret that was about to change my entire life. I had just left the downtown Atlanta office of my attorney Sterling. He had handed me the documents confirming that my Great Aunt Josephine had left her entire $55 million estate and her luxury beachfront hotel chain entirely to me. My great aunt was a legend in our family, a fiercely independent black woman who built her hospitality empire from the ground up during the civil rights era. She had always told me that she saw my potential even when I chose to shrink myself to fit into my husband's shadow. Now she had given me the ultimate gift of freedom. I could barely contain my excitement as I pulled my car into the long, gated driveway of the Buckhead estate I shared with my husband Darius. My mind was racing with plans for our future, envisioning the legacy we could build together with this sudden influx of immense wealth. But the joy completely drained from my body when I saw him standing on the front porch. He was not alone. Chloe, his 26-year-old subordinate at the real estate firm, was standing right beside him. Her arms were wrapped tightly around his waist, and she was holding a thick stack of legal documents. Before I could even turn off the engine, she smirked and told me to pack my bags because there was no place in this house for someone useless. I simply smiled softly and said, "Okay." She screamed, asking if I was crazy. I calmly replied that she should just wait and see who was really going to have to leave. Before I dive into exactly how I destroyed their arrogant facade, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe. If you have ever had to teach a harsh lesson to someone who completely underestimated your worth. I stepped out of my car and closed the door with a firm, solid thud. The humid Atlanta air felt heavy, but my mind was operating with crystal clarity. Darius was wearing his custom-tailored Italian suit, the very same brand I had worked 3 grueling jobs to afford for him when he was just a struggling nobody trying to pass his real estate exams. Chloe stood there in a skin-tight designer dress, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the manila folder in her hands. This was the woman Darius had been mentoring at his luxury real estate brokerage. He had always claimed their late-night meetings and weekend trips were just part of building his elite team, a necessary step to secure the wealthiest clients in Georgia. Standing there on the pristine brick pavers of our driveway, the reality of his betrayal was staring me right in the face. He did not look guilty. He did not look ashamed. He looked impatient, checking his gold Rolex while his mistress clung to him like a trophy. I walked slowly up the front steps, my designer heels clicking against the stone, projecting a calm I knew would unnerve them both. I stopped on the top step, looking back and forth between my husband of 10 years and the young woman who thought she had just won a grand prize. Darius finally spoke, his voice dripping with the condescension he usually reserved for his competitors in the housing market. He told me that we needed to make this quick and painless. He said that our marriage was over and Chloe was moving in by the end of the week. He snatched the manila folder from Chloe and shoved it toward my chest, divorce papers, already drawn up and completely biased in his favor. Chloe giggled, a sharp grating sound that echoed across the manicured lawn. She stepped forward, looking me up and down with absolute disgust, her eyes lingering mockingly on my conservative blouse and sensible shoes. She told me that I needed to pack my cheap bags and get out today. She said that a top-tier luxury broker like Darius needed a partner who actually understood the high society of Atlanta, not some burned-out former event planner who spent her days organizing community bake sales and managing a household. She leaned in close, her heavy perfume making me want to gag, and delivered her final blow. She told me that there was no place in this house for someone useless. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not throw the thick stack of papers back in his face. Instead, I looked directly at Darius. I asked him if he really agreed with her assessment of my value. I asked him if the woman who had sacrificed her entire career so he could build his name was now just useless baggage to be discarded on the front porch. Darius did not even have the decency to look me in the eye. He adjusted his silk tie and told me that I had to face facts. He said he was operating at a completely different level now, dealing with multi-million-dollar mega mansions and the most elite demanding clients in the city. He claimed my working-class mindset was holding him back from reaching his true potential. He said I just did not fit his grand image anymore, and that he needed someone young, hungry, and visibly successful by his side. His words were a masterclass in rewriting history and gaslighting. When I met Darius, he was drowning in student loan debt and working a dead-end retail job just to make ends meet. I was the one with a thriving event planning business. I was the one who saw his potential when no one else gave him a second glance. For 4 solid years, I worked days, nights, and weekends, funding his expensive real estate courses, paying for his glossy marketing materials, and buying him the expensive suits he needed to fake it until he made it in the cutthroat Atlanta real estate market. I stepped back from my own successful business to manage his chaotic schedule format, his complex contracts, and build his exclusive client roster from scratch. I gave him the absolute foundation for his current empire. Now that he was finally tasting real wealth and rubbing elbows with millionaires, he was treating me like a broken stepping stone he no longer needed to stand on. He pointed a finger at me, his tone hardening to issue a threat. He told me the house was solely in his name, a decision I had agreed to years ago to help protect his credit rating. He reminded me that because I had stopped working to support his career, I had no independent income, no personal savings, and no power to fight him in an expensive legal battle. He said he was offering me a fast-track divorce. If I signed the papers relinquishing all rights to the property and his brokerage business, he would give me $5,000 to help me transition to a cheap apartment in a lesser neighborhood. If I refused this generous offer, he threatened to drag the proceedings out in court until I was drowning in insurmountable legal fees and left absolutely homeless. Chloe smirked again, crossing her arms over her chest in a display of false superiority. She told me I should take the $5,000 and sign up for a community college course to learn a real skill so I could finally stop leeching off successful men. I looked down at the divorce papers in my hands. The documents demanded a complete, unconditional waiver of all marital assets, an expedited process that heavily bypasses the usual waiting periods and financial disclosures. My analytical mind, the exact same mind that had organized massive corporate galas and effortlessly managed Darius's complex real estate logistics, immediately caught the glaring discrepancy. Darius was a proud, arrogant man, but he was also notoriously cheap and calculating. Why would he rush a divorce so aggressively and offer a lump sum of cash to completely bypass the discovery phase? He was desperately trying to close this chapter at lightning speed. He was hiding something massive, likely a monumental commission from a new commercial development, and he wanted me completely legally severed from him before that enormous amount of money hit his banking accounts. What neither of them knew, standing there with their smug smiles and rehearsed insults, was that by rushing to legally sever me from his assets, he was blindly sprinting headfirst into the greatest financial trap of his entire life. In my purse, resting just inches from his arrogant face, was the certified letter from Attorney Sterling. $55 million and a luxury hospitality empire were now legally mine, effective immediately. If we were still married when those assets were fully processed and audited, Georgia law might give him a small window to drag me to court and claim a percentage of my aunt's legacy. But by aggressively shoving these fast-track divorce papers at me, Darius was practically begging the legal system to cut himself off from the very wealth he had always obsessed over. I smiled softly, a genuine smile of absolute calm that clearly unsettled them both, and said, "Okay." Chloe looked completely taken aback. She shrieked, asking if I was crazy, clearly disappointed that she was not getting the dramatic weeping reaction she had so eagerly hoped for. I calmly replied that she should just wait and see who was really going to have to leave this estate. I pushed past them, ignoring their confused, sputtering protests. I told them I was not signing a single page until I spoke to my son. I marched through the heavy oak front doors, bracing myself for the next battle. I needed an ally in this massive, suddenly cold house, and I was praying my 16-year-old son Malik would be the one to stand by my side. The heavy oak front doors of our Buckhead estate slammed shut behind me, vibrating the framed photographs that lined the grand entryway. I did not stop walking until I reached the center of our custom-designed kitchen. I ran my fingers along the cool, polished surface of the Calcutta marble island. I had spent months sourcing that exact stone, negotiating endlessly with local contractors, and stretching our tiny budget to its absolute breaking point, back when Darius was just a struggling rookie agent trying to catch a break. I had chosen the brushed brass fixtures, the high-end Viking appliances, and the imported hardwood floors. Now Darius treated this entire space like a royal fortress he had built entirely with his own two hands. His heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway right behind me. He marched into the kitchen, his jaw clenched tight with visible irritation that I had not completely broken down weeping on the front porch. He tossed a thick manila folder onto the marble island with a sharp, dismissive slap. The sound cracked like a whip in the silent kitchen. He told me to stop dragging this out and making a fool of myself. He said I was acting ridiculous by walking away from Chloe out there, and that I needed to sit down, take the pen, and sign the legal documents right now. His tone was not just demanding, it was frantically impatient. Beneath the polished veneer of his tailored Italian suit and expensive designer cologne, there was a desperate, nervous energy radiating from his every movement. Darius leaned heavily across the marble island, invading my personal space, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me into submission. He aggressively explained the harsh reality of my situation. He reminded me, his voice dripping with condescension, that the deed to the estate was solely in his name. We had put the property in his name 6 years ago because my credit was entirely tied up in massive personal loans I took out to pay for his real estate licensing, his professional wardrobe, and his initial marketing campaigns. I had trusted him completely with our financial foundation. Now he was ruthlessly weaponizing that exact trust against me. He stated that legally, I had absolutely no claim to the property. He systematically listed off the luxury cars, the lucrative brokerage accounts, and the high-yield investment portfolios, declaring them all completely untouchable to a woman with no current income. Then he laid out his grand, insulting compromise. He told me he was willing to be incredibly generous because he pitied my situation. He offered a flat one-time severance payment of exactly $5,000. $5,000 for 10 grueling years of marriage. $5,000 for building his entire professional foundation from nothing. He slid a sleek silver pen across the marble toward my hand. He warned me that if I did not take this generous deal today, he would immediately rescind the cash offer and unleash his elite legal team. He bragged about his high-powered Buckhead attorneys, men who charged thousands of dollars an hour, men who specialized in absolutely destroying dependent spouses in the courtroom. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a vicious, threatening whisper. He promised that if I tried to fight him for a single dime, his lawyers would tie me up in aggressive litigation for years. They would freeze my access to any joint checking funds, drag my reputation through the mud across Atlanta society, and ensure I walked away with nothing but a pile of insurmountable legal debt. He told me to be smart for once in my miserable life. Take the $5,000 and go quietly. Find a cheap apartment in a lesser neighborhood where I belonged. I stared at the silver pen resting on the cold marble. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice in a desperate scream. The seasoned event planner inside me, the woman who had spent a decade managing complex logistics, mitigating absolute disasters, and seeing 5 steps ahead of every major corporate crisis, instantly took over my body. My analytical mind kicked into high gear. I tuned out his arrogant rambling and focused entirely on his frantic behavior. Darius was a man obsessed with his public image and fiercely protective of every single dollar he earned. He was notoriously cheap behind closed doors. He would aggressively dispute a $50 charge on a restaurant bill just to prove a point. Yet here he was, actively pushing for a fast-track divorce, voluntarily offering a lump sum of cash up front, and demanding a complete ironclad waiver of the financial discovery process. Why would a greedy, calculating man deliberately rush to legally sever marital assets without a thorough audit? The answer hit me with the force of a speeding freight train. He was hiding something massive. I mentally scanned his recent behaviors over the past month. The secretive phone calls taken out on the back patio late at night. The sudden lavish spending on Chloe's designer clothes. The hushed, frantic conversations with his financial manager that he abruptly ended the second I walked into the room. He was on the absolute verge of closing a monumental deal. I remembered him bragging a few weeks ago about a mega mansion development project in the upscale northern suburbs, a commercial deal worth tens of millions of dollars. The commission on a project of that incredible scale would be astronomical. If we went through a standard prolonged divorce process, my attorneys would undoubtedly uncover that pending commission during the mandatory financial discovery phase, and I would be legally entitled to half of it. He was attempting to push this fast-track divorce through before that money officially hit his corporate accounts. He wanted to cut me off and lock me out just days before his biggest payday ever materialized. A profound sense of vindicating irony washed over my entire being. Darius thought he was outsmarting me. He thought he was brilliantly shielding his upcoming commission from a naive working-class housewife who did not understand the real estate market. I had absolutely no idea that by aggressively pushing this fast-track divorce and forcing me to sign a comprehensive waiver of all marital assets, he was simultaneously relinquishing any future legal claim to my assets. He was blindly locking himself out of the $55 million fortune and the luxury resort empire I had just inherited from Great Aunt Josephine. If I fought him today, if I dragged this messy separation out in court just to claim a tiny piece of his real estate commission, the legal system would inevitably uncover my new inheritance. Under Georgia law, if we were still legally married when those trust funds settled, he could potentially stake a legal claim on a percentage of my massive empire. By shoving these papers in my face and demanding an immediate, uncontested separation, Darius was actively protecting my immense wealth. He was handing me the exact legal shield I needed to keep my $55 million entirely out of his greedy, thieving hands. I knew I could not let him see the realization sparking in my eyes. I had to play the part of the broken, terrified wife to ensure he remained blindly confident in his flawless scheme. I let my shoulders slump slightly forward. I looked away from his piercing gaze, fixing my eyes firmly on the hardwood floor, as if I were utterly defeated by his threats. I let my voice tremble just a fraction when I finally spoke. I asked him how he could be so intensely cruel after everything we had built together from the ground up. I asked him if 10 years of my absolute loyalty really amounted to a pathetic $5,000 buyout. Darius practically beamed, completely falling for my calculated performance. His chest puffed out with arrogant satisfaction. He told me that loyalty does not pay the luxury mortgages in high society. He said business is just business and our marriage was simply a bad investment he finally needed to liquidate to secure his future. He tapped his manicured index finger against the signature line on the final page of the divorce decree. He demanded that I stop stalling, pick up the pen, and accept my harsh new reality. I slowly reached for the silver pen, letting my fingertips brush against the cool metal. But I did not pick it up. Instead, I pushed the heavy manila folder back toward him just an inch. I told him I needed a moment to breathe. I told him I would not sign away my entire life and leave this house without speaking to my son first. I needed to know exactly where Malik stood in the middle of all this orchestrated madness. Darius scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes in exaggerated exasperation. He told me I was wasting my time, claiming Malik already understood that his father was the only parent who could provide a real wealthy future. Before Darius could utter another degrading insult, a loud, explosive barrage of digital gunfire echoed down the long hallway. The unmistakable sound of a high-intensity video game was coming directly from our sprawling living room. Malik was home. The teenage son I had nurtured, protected, and loved with every ounce of my being was sitting just a few rooms away, while his father actively tried to throw me out onto the street. I turned my back on Darius, completely ignoring his angry demands to come back and finish signing the legal paperwork. I left him fuming alone in the custom kitchen I had built with my own sweat. I walked down the sunlit corridor toward the living room, my heart pounding aggressively against my ribs. I was desperately hoping to find a loyal ally, praying that my son would see through his father's toxic facade and stand firmly by my side. I stepped silently through the wide archway into the sunken living room. The massive 80-inch flat-screen television dominated the far wall, flashing with the hyper-realistic explosions of a high-stakes video game. Sitting on the center cushion of our plush sectional sofa was Malik. My 16-year-old son was hunched forward, his eyes locked intensely on the screen, a gaming headset clamped securely over his ears. He was completely blissfully oblivious to the marital warfare raging just a few rooms away. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing pulse. I needed him to understand the severity of the crisis. I walked around the suede sofa and stepped directly into his peripheral vision. I reached out gently, tapping his shoulder, ready to wrap my arms around him and tell him that we were going to be okay. We would pack his essentials, head to a hotel downtown, and then I would reveal the incredible news about Great Aunt Josephine's massive inheritance. I wanted to reassure him that his mother had the power and the resources to protect him from his father's sudden cruelty. Malik startled slightly at my touch. He pulled one side of his headset off, his expression instantly contorting into a mask of unadulterated teenage annoyance. I tried to lean in for a hug, my maternal instincts overriding the heavy tension in the air. I told him we needed to go upstairs right now. I kept my voice incredibly calm, desperately trying to shield him from the ugly reality of his father's betrayal. I said we needed to pack a few overnight bags, because his father and I were separating and we were leaving this house today. Instead of the confusion or fear I expected, Malik reacted with physical revulsion. He violently jerked his shoulder away from my reaching arms, throwing himself back against the sofa cushions, as if my touch was somehow toxic or offensive. He let out a harsh, mocking sigh, pausing his high-stakes game and tossing the sleek white controller aggressively onto the glass coffee table. I did not look at me with love or concern. He looked at me with the exact same cold, calculating disdain that Darius had just weaponized against me in the kitchen. He told me I was acting completely unhinged. His voice lacked any trace of the compassionate boy I had raised. He stated very clearly that he was not going anywhere with me. He crossed his arms over his chest, a gesture copied directly from his arrogant father, and declared that he was staying right here. The absolute certainty in his voice felt like a physical blow. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the sheer hostility radiating from his teenage frame. I explained that his father was throwing me out onto the street and moving another woman into our home. I pleaded with him to understand that we had to stick together. Malik rolled his eyes, a gesture so filled with entitlement that it made my blood run cold. He casually pointed toward the television stand. Sitting right next to the massive screen was a brand new, highly sought-after PS5 console. The sleek white machine gleamed under the recessed lighting. I had told Malik just last week that we needed to wait until his birthday to make such an expensive purchase, emphasizing the value of patience. Now the expensive console was sitting right there, completely undermining my parental authority. He proudly announced that Chloe had bought the console for him yesterday. He said she actually understood what he wanted and did not constantly lecture him about saving money or building character. He praised his father's mistress with genuine admiration, entirely dismissing the woman who had sacrificed her own career to ensure he had a perfect childhood. My heart shattered into a million tiny, irreparable pieces. Darius and Chloe had systematically and ruthlessly bought my son's loyalty with flashy electronics and cheap bribes. I tried to find my voice, struggling against the rising tide of absolute heartbreak. I asked him how he could possibly side with a woman who was actively destroying our family just because she bought him a piece of plastic. I desperately searched his eyes, looking for any sign of the thoughtful boy I had nurtured. I wanted to see a flicker of guilt, a moment of hesitation, anything to prove that Darius had not completely corrupted his soul. But Malik's expression remained stone cold. He leaned forward, adopting the exact predatory posture his father used when negotiating a ruthless real estate contract. He revealed the ultimate bribe. He smirked and proudly stated that his father had promised to buy him a fully loaded custom Tesla the minute he turned 17 next year. He boasted about the specific model, the expensive upgrades, and the status he would command when he drove it into the high school parking lot. He said his dad was a true boss who knew how to provide a luxury lifestyle and that sticking with the winner was just basic logic. He was speaking to me, not as a son, speaking to his mother, but as a business partner, evaluating a terrible investment. He had weighed the two options before him. On one side was his mother, a woman he believed was entirely broke, powerless, and about to be evicted. On the other side was his father, a man flashing immense wealth, handing out expensive gifts, and promising elite status symbols. Malik had calculated the material benefits and made his choice without a single ounce of hesitation. He was trading his own mother for a luxury electric vehicle and a gaming console. The sheer transactional nature of his betrayal paralyzed me. I stood perfectly still, my breathing shallow as the full weight of his horrific entitlement crashed down upon my shoulders. I had spent years trying to shield him from Darius's narcissistic, money-obsessed worldview. I had forced him to volunteer at community centers and tried to instill a deep sense of moral character. But Darius had completely overridden all of my hard work with the promise of shiny objects and elite social standing. The toxic culture of Atlanta's superficial high society had thoroughly infected my own child's mind. Then Malik delivered the deepest, most agonizing cut of all. He looked me straight in the eyes, his teenage face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated contempt. He told me to just go. He said I was completely embarrassing to be around. He stated that Dad and Chloe were building a real powerful empire in this city, and that they actually belonged at the top of the social ladder. He sneered, his voice dropping into a harsh, mocking tone, and declared that I did not even have a real career anymore. He called me a failure who was just dragging everyone else down. His cruel words echoed loudly in the expansive living room, bouncing off the high ceilings and sinking deep into my bones. He had repeated Darius's exact talking points verbatim. My son viewed my immense sacrifice, the deliberate choice to step away from my own thriving business, to manage our household, and support his father's dreams as an embarrassing failure. He saw my dedication to our family as weakness. He saw my lack of a flashy, aggressive career as a pathetic flaw that justified discarding me like yesterday's trash. A cold, rational clarity instantly washed over the bleeding wounds in my heart. The maternal desperation that had driven me into this room completely evaporated. I stopped seeing a misguided child who needed to be saved from his father's toxic influence. I saw a young man who had eagerly embraced the darkness. He had made his choice with full agency, fully aware of the immense pain he was inflicting upon me. He did not want my protection. He did not value my love. He only valued the material wealth he believed his father could provide. I did not yell. I did not attempt to argue with his warped materialistic logic. I simply looked at him, my posture straightening, my spine turning to absolute steel. I realized in that precise moment that I could not save someone who fundamentally did not want to be saved. If he wanted to worship at the altar of his father's fragile, fraudulent ego, I would have to let him. I would have to step back and allow him to learn the harsh, unforgiving lessons of the real world on his own. I would give him exactly what he arrogantly demanded. I would walk away. I nodded slowly, a small, icy smile touching the very corners of my lips. I told him I completely understood his decision. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away all maternal warmth, leaving only a calm, businesslike detachment. I told him to enjoy his new video game and to make sure he held his father entirely accountable for that promised luxury car. I turned my back on my only child, feeling the final decaying thread of my old life cleanly snap. I had nothing left to tie me to this toxic household. I was entirely ready to walk out the front door, finalize the legal trap Darius had blindly set for himself, and begin building my own untouchable empire. But before I could take another step toward the hallway, a massive, chaotic noise erupted from the front of the house. The heavy oak front door banged violently open, hitting the interior wall with a thunderous crash that shook the floorboards beneath my feet. Loud, aggressive voices instantly filled the grand entryway. I froze in the middle of the living room, my entire body tensing as a fresh wave of hostility flooded into the estate. The fast-track divorce was not going to be a quiet, private execution. Darius had clearly called in reinforcements to ensure my complete, utter humiliation. A new vicious threat had just marched across my threshold, ready to drag this nightmare to an entirely new level. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of stiletto heels hammered against the imported hardwood floors of the foyer. I stepped out of the living room, leaving the hollow shell of my son behind to face the source of the commotion. Standing in the center of my grand entryway was Tasha, my husband's 34-year-old sister. She was flanked by Darius and Chloe, who had apparently lingered on the front porch just long enough to grant her a dramatic, unimpeded entrance into the house. Tasha dropped a massive roll of heavy-duty black trash bags onto the pristine floor. The thick plastic slapped against the wood with a dull, heavy thud. She placed her hands on her hips, striking a pose she undoubtedly thought looked powerful and intimidating. She was wearing a violently bright fuchsia pantsuit, an ensemble she had purchased using a credit card I had personally paid off for her just 6 months ago. Now she was standing in the home I had financed, looking at me as if I were a squatter who had overstayed her welcome. Tasha did not even bother offering a greeting. She marched directly toward the custom-built walk-in closet situated near the front entrance. I had designed that closet myself, outfitting it with cedar shelving and ambient lighting to properly store our winter coats and formal footwear. Tasha ripped the door open so aggressively that the brass handle banged against the adjacent wall, chipping the custom paint. She unfurled one of the thick black garbage bags with a loud, aggressive snap. Without a single ounce of hesitation, Tasha began grabbing my belongings. She ripped my tailored wool coats off their wooden hangers, tearing the fabric of a delicate trench coat in her frantic haste, and shoved them violently into the dark plastic bag. She kicked my leather boots into a pile, scooping them up by the handful and tossing them in like discarded waste. She was breathing heavily, her face twisted into a mask of pure, vindictive joy. She was absolutely relishing the opportunity to dismantle my life piece by piece. I stood quietly in the hallway watching her erratic, desperate performance. Tasha did not stop her frantic packing, but she turned her head to glare at me, her eyes sweeping over my simple outfit with absolute disgust. She loudly declared that pest control had finally arrived to clean up the mess. Her voice was grating, echoing off the high ceilings and carrying straight to Darius and Chloe, who were standing near the front door watching the spectacle like entertained audience members. Tasha sneered, tossing a pair of my designer heels into the garbage bag. She told me that her entire family had been waiting for this glorious day for a whole decade. She spat out the words, claiming they always knew I was nothing but a glorified maid. She said I had somehow managed to trick her brilliant brother into settling for a working-class nobody. But my lease on high society had officially expired. She parroted around the foyer, waving one of my silk scarves like a cheap rag. Tasha loudly proclaimed that Darius was finally ascending to the true, untouchable upper echelon of Atlanta society. She talked about the exclusive country clubs, the million-dollar charity galas, and the elite social circles that demanded a certain pedigree. She said that a woman like me, a woman who actually worried about clipping coupons, managing household budgets, and working multiple jobs, was a heavy anchor dragging her brother down to the ghetto. She proudly announced that Chloe came from a family that actually understood generational wealth, completely ignoring the fact that Chloe was currently embezzling money to fund her own lifestyle. Tasha stepped closer to me, aggressively shaking the half-full garbage bag in my direction. She told me I should be incredibly grateful they let me play house in Buckhead for as long as I did. She claimed her mother and her had always hated my practical, sensible nature. They despised that I refused to lease luxury cars we could not afford, and that I refused to buy fake designer handbags just to impress strangers at Sunday brunch. Tasha pointed a long acrylic nail right at my face and told me to take my trash bags and walk back to the poverty line where I belonged. A sharp, intense surge of white-hot anger flared up in my chest. For a split second, the exhausted, heartbroken wife inside me wanted to step forward and slap the arrogant smirk right off Tasha's face. I wanted to remind her of the countless times I had paid her rent, covered her car insurance, and bailed her out of massive credit card debt when Darius refused to answer her calls. I wanted to scream that everything in this house existed because I had built the financial foundation that allowed them all to play pretend. But the anger vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a deep, profound sense of absolute clarity. I looked at the black garbage bags filled with coats and shoes. I looked at Tasha's desperate, flashy suit. I looked at Darius and Chloe standing by the door, completely dependent on stolen money and fraudulent real estate deals to fund their miserable existence. I realized in that exact moment that the designer clothes Tasha was aggressively shoving into the trash bags were absolutely worthless to me now. I was standing there as the legal owner of a $55 million liquid fortune and a nationwide empire of luxury beachfront resorts. I could buy and sell this entire Buckhead subdivision before lunchtime. I did not need a single coat, shoe, or handbag from this house. Those items represented the small, suffocating cage I had locked myself in to make a mediocre man feel powerful. I was entirely ready to shed that old skin. I took a calm, measured step forward. Tasha braced herself, clutching the garbage bag tightly to her chest, eagerly anticipating a screaming match. Darius stepped forward slightly, ready to intervene and play the protective hero for his mistress. Instead of raising my voice, I offered Tasha a soft, chillingly polite smile. I spoke with a quiet, unbothered dignity that instantly sucked all the chaotic energy out of the room. I told Tasha that she could save her energy. I instructed her to keep the bags, keep the coats, and keep every single pair of shoes. I told her she was going to desperately need them when reality finally caught up with her brother's bank account. I said she could sell my old wardrobe to pay for her next credit card minimum payment because the free ride I had been financing was officially over. Tasha blinked, her mouth falling slightly open in pure confusion. My total lack of panic completely short-circuited her rehearsed performance. She looked down at the trash bag, suddenly feeling entirely foolish holding a bunch of clothes I did not even want. I walked right past her, brushing my shoulder against hers, without a single ounce of hesitation. I ignored Darius and Chloe, completely moving with purpose down the hall toward the master suite. I did not waste time mourning the custom bedroom I had decorated. I walked straight to my private filing cabinet. I grabbed a small, nondescript canvas duffel bag from the bottom drawer. I moved methodically and efficiently. I packed my passport, my birth certificate, my social security card, and the private financial ledgers I had kept hidden from Darius. I grabbed a small stack of comfortable, practical clothes, simple jeans, soft sweaters, and clean undergarments. I left the expensive jewelry Darius had bought me sitting on the velvet display tray. I left the high-end cosmetics and the imported perfumes sitting on the bathroom vanity. I packed nothing that carried the stench of his fake, fraudulent lifestyle. Within exactly 5 minutes, I had zipped the small duffel bag closed. I slung the single strap over my shoulder and walked back out into the main hallway. The entire house was eerily silent. Tasha had dropped the trash bag on the floor, crossing her arms defensively. Darius was staring at me with a deep, unsettling confusion furrowing his brow. My absolute stoicism was severely unnerving him. He had expected begging, crying, and a desperate fight for the property. My eager willingness to leave with just a tiny duffel bag made no logical sense to his greedy, calculating mind. I stopped right in front of the open oak door. I looked at the three of them, taking in their arrogant, pathetic posturing one final time. I told Darius that he could have the house, the empty bank accounts, and the fake life he was desperately trying to uphold. I told Chloe she was incredibly welcome to my sloppy seconds. I did not wait for their sputtering responses. I turned my back and stepped out into the blinding Georgia sunlight. I walked down the wide, paved driveway with a steady, unhurried pace. I did not look back at the sprawling brick estate. I did not look up at Malik's bedroom window. I focused entirely on the heavy, humid Atlanta heat pressing against my skin. It felt like a baptism. I was shedding the weak, accommodating woman I had been for the last decade and stepping fully into the immense power that Great Aunt Josephine had bestowed upon me. I reached the edge of the property where the manicured lawn met the public sidewalk. The shade of a large oak tree provided a brief respite from the glaring sun. I stopped, dropping the small duffel bag by my feet. I reached into my purse and pulled out my smartphone. My thumb hovered over the screen for a fraction of a second before I tapped the contact icon for Attorney Sterling. The line rang twice before his deep, professional voice answered. I did not waste time with pleasantries or greetings. I spoke with absolute lethal precision. I told Sterling that I needed an emergency meeting right now. I said Darius is hiding assets and I'm going to let him dig his own grave. Sterling's corner office on the 40th floor of the premier Buckhead high-rise offered a sweeping, uninterrupted view of the entire Atlanta skyline. I stepped out of the private elevator, my small canvas duffel bag slung tightly over my shoulder. It was the only physical remnant of my 10-year marriage to a man I now barely recognized. The receptionist, a polished young woman in a sharp designer blazer, immediately recognized me and ushered me straight through the heavy frosted glass doors into Sterling's private sanctuary. Sterling was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk. He was a formidable, sharply dressed African-American man in his mid-40s, renowned across Georgia for his ruthless surgical precision in managing high-net-worth estates. He had been Great Aunt Josephine's most trusted legal counsel for over a decade, I knew the absolute magnitude of the $55 million empire I had just inherited, and he knew exactly how vicious the opportunistic predators in this city could be when they smelled fresh blood. I dropped my duffel bag onto one of the plush leather guest chairs. I sat down across from him, my posture straight, my voice completely devoid of the panic that usually accompanied a sudden aggressive divorce filing. I laid out every single detail of the confrontation that had just occurred on my front porch. I told him about the fast-track divorce papers Darius had shoved in my face, the incredibly insulting $5,000 severance offer, and the frantic, almost desperate timeline my husband was aggressively trying to enforce. Sterling listened in absolute silence, his dark eyes narrowing with intense, calculating focus. He pressed his fingertips together, resting his chin on his hands. He did not offer empty sympathy or useless platitudes about a broken heart. He treated me exactly like the powerful CEO I was now destined to become. He stated that a man like Darius, a luxury broker who worshipped wealth and status above all else, would never voluntarily expedite a divorce unless he was actively trying to conceal a massive impending financial windfall. Sterling picked up his desk phone and immediately instructed his lead forensic accountant to pull every available public and private record attached to Darius's elite brokerage firm. We sat in the quiet office, the faint hum of the city traffic echoing far below us, as Sterling's dedicated legal team worked with lightning speed. Within 45 minutes, Sterling's computer chimed with an incoming encrypted file. He opened the digital documents, his eyes rapidly scanning the dense financial data, corporate bank statements, and recent real estate filings. A slow, deeply knowing smile spread across his face. He turned his sleek monitor slightly so I could clearly see the screen. Sterling revealed the exact, undeniable truth I had suspected. Darius was currently in the final, highly confidential stages of closing a monumental commercial real estate transaction. It was a massive, unprecedented development deal for a sprawling gated community of ultra-luxury mega mansions located in the prestigious northern suburbs of Atlanta. The total valuation of the commercial project was a staggering $40 million. As the lead broker and primary negotiator for the acquiring firm, Darius was set to receive a historic multi-million-dollar commission that would instantly catapult him into the highest tier of Atlanta's wealthy elite. Sterling explained the aggressive timeline with absolute clarity. The mega mansion deal was scheduled to officially close and fund within the next 30 days. If Darius proceeded with a standard, legally contested divorce, the mandatory financial discovery period would force him to completely open his accounting books. My legal team would easily spot the pending $40 million transaction under Georgia marital property laws, because the rigorous groundwork for that massive deal was laid during the course of our 10-year marriage. I would be legally entitled to demand a substantial percentage of that unprecedented commission check. Darius was utterly terrified of losing a single penny to the woman who had actually funded his initial real estate license. He was ruthlessly orchestrating this aggressive fast-track divorce to ensure I was legally cut off and financially severed from him before his commission money ever cleared the bank. He was using Chloe as a flashy, loud distraction, banking on the arrogant assumption that I would be so emotionally devastated by his blatant infidelity and so humiliated by being thrown out of my own house that I would blindly sign the waiver just to escape the trauma. He wanted me to accept his pathetic $5,000 bribe, completely unaware that he was about to rake in millions of dollars behind my back. I felt a cold, sharp laugh rising in the back of my throat. Darius had always severely underestimated my intelligence. He assumed that because I had voluntarily stepped back to manage our home and support his towering ambitions, my analytical brain had somehow completely atrophied. He genuinely believed his manipulative, high-pressure tactics would break my spirit. I thought he was playing grandmaster chess while I was playing checkers. He had no idea I had just flipped the entire board on him. Sterling leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, the knowing smile on his face growing significantly wider. He looked at me with a profound sense of professional admiration. He told me that Darius's insatiable greed was about to be his absolute, inescapable undoing. Sterling revealed a brilliant, deeply ironic legal loophole that was going to turn my ex-husband's malicious scheme completely upside down. Sterling carefully broke down the complex legal reality of my newly acquired inheritance. Great Aunt Josephine's trust had officially transferred the $55 million in liquid assets and the controlling corporate shares of the Oasis Resorts chain directly into my name earlier this morning. However, under standard Georgia law, inherited wealth could sometimes become legally vulnerable if a bitter, vindictive spouse decided to drag the divorce out in court and claim they had somehow contributed to the preservation or growth of that wealth during the marriage. If Darius caught even a slight whisper of my massive new fortune before the divorce was fully finalized, he would instantly abandon his fast-track strategy. He would hire the most vicious, aggressive litigators in Atlanta to tie up my inheritance in endless legal injunctions. He would shamelessly demand a massive payout, suddenly claiming that his 10 years of marriage entitled him to a generous, unyarned slice of Great Aunt Josephine's legacy. He would enthusiastically drag my name through the mud, weaponize the legal system, and fight me tooth and nail for every single dime I possessed. But Darius had absolutely no idea the inheritance existed. He was so entirely blinded by his own $40 million real estate deal and his desperate, frantic desire to protect his upcoming commission that he was literally handing me the perfect, impenetrable legal shield. Sterling pointed to the printed copy of the divorce papers I had brought with me in my duffel bag. He tapped his finger heavily against the specific clause Darius's lawyers had aggressively highlighted on the third page. It was a comprehensive, ironclad waiver of financial discovery. By signing that exact document, both parties were legally agreeing to entirely relinquish any and all future claims to the other person's assets, whether currently known or entirely unknown. Darius had forced his lawyers to draft the most aggressive, restrictive waiver possible, utilizing dense, impenetrable legal jargon designed to ensure I could never come back and sue him for his real estate commission. The document specifically mandated that neither party could lay claim to any assets, inheritances, trusts, or business revenues acquired independently or previously concealed. Sterling's voice dropped to a low, incredibly powerful register. He explained the reverse trap perfectly. By frantically rushing this fast-track divorce and aggressively forcing me to sign that specific waiver, relinquishing all rights to his current and future assets, Darius was simultaneously legally relinquishing all rights to mine. I was intentionally locking himself out of a $55 million empire just to aggressively hoard a commission that was a mere fraction of my new net worth. The sheer, undeniable, poetic justice of the situation was staggering. Darius was frantically digging a deep moat to protect his small treasure chest, completely unaware that he was walling himself off from an absolute gold mine. He was actively weaponizing the legal system against me, but that very same legal system was about to become my ultimate impenetrable protection. I sat back in my chair, absorbing the brilliant, devastating reality of Sterling's legal strategy. My heart was no longer pounding with the heavy, suffocating anxiety of a betrayed, discarded wife. It was beating with the steady, powerful rhythm of a woman who had just realized she held every single winning card in the deck. I thought about the cruel, arrogant smirk on Chloe's face when she stood on my porch and told me to pack my bags. I thought about Tasha aggressively shoving my tailored coats into black garbage bags, mocking my working-class background and loudly claiming I was holding her brother back from true high society. I thought about my own son Malik, looking me dead in the eye and calling me an embarrassing failure because he had been bought and paid for with a simple video game console and the shallow promise of a luxury car. The betrayal of my own child was a deep, agonizing wound that would never fully heal, but it also served as the ultimate catalyst for my absolute, unshakable detachment. They had all looked at me and seen a weak, powerless victim they could effortlessly discard. They had eagerly rushed to push me out the door, desperate to clear the path for their fraudulent, flashy new lifestyle. They wanted me gone quickly, cleanly, and completely. I looked across the mahogany desk at Sterling. The seasoned attorney was watching me closely, patiently waiting for my final decision. He asked me if I wanted his legal team to aggressively contest the divorce filing significantly, stall the proceedings, and formally drag Darius into a prolonged court battle to seize half of his $40 million commission. He offered to utterly destroy Darius's real estate deal and drag his ugly infidelity directly into the public record for all of Atlanta to see. I shook my head slowly, my voice entirely devoid of any hesitation, doubt, or fear. I told Sterling that fighting Darius for a small fraction of his commission would be a monumental waste of my extremely valuable time. I firmly stated that dragging this out in court would only alert Darius to my newly acquired wealth, giving him a highly dangerous window of opportunity to pivot his legal strategy and attempt to stake a claim on Great Aunt Josephine's massive legacy. I realized in that exact moment that I did not need to fight his vicious fast-track divorce. I needed to completely and utterly accelerate it. I needed to give my arrogant, cheating husband exactly what he was aggressively demanding. I needed to sign that ironclad waiver, sever our legal ties with record-breaking speed, and let him lock himself securely inside his own carefully constructed financial prison. I leaned forward, resting my hands firmly on the polished wood of the desk. I looked Sterling directly in the eye, my entire transformation from a discarded housewife into a ruthless, untouchable CEO completely finalized in that quiet high-rise office. I told Sterling to cancel any plans to contest the legal filing. I instructed him to review the waiver one final time to ensure my $55 million empire was entirely protected from any future claims Darius might attempt to fabricate. Once Sterling confirmed the legal shield was completely flawless and airtight, I smiled. It was a cold, sharp, and highly calculated smile. I told Sterling to prepare my pen. The sterile conference room inside the high-priced Buckhead law firm was designed entirely to intimidate. Cold glass walls, a massive gray slate table, and aggressively bright overhead lighting created an atmosphere completely devoid of any human warmth. I walked in wearing a simple, understated beige sweater and plain slacks. I had deliberately left my posture slightly slumped, keeping my eyes downcast as if the sheer weight of the impending divorce was actively crushing my spirit. Sterling walked right beside me, playing his part flawlessly. He carried a single thin leather portfolio, intentionally projecting the image of a defeated legal counsel who knew his client had absolutely no leverage to negotiate against a titan of the real estate industry. Waiting for us on the opposite side of the sprawling slate table was the opposition. Darius sat perfectly upright in a custom navy suit, his chest puffed out with the unearned confidence of a man who believed he had already won the war. Beside him sat Chloe, wearing a highly inappropriate skin-tight designer dress that practically screamed for validation. Flanking them was Darius's lead attorney, a smug, slicked-back man named Harrison, who looked at me with the thinly veiled contempt reserved for women he routinely stripped of their marital assets. I pulled out a heavy metal chair and took my seat. I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap, acting the part of the terrified, discarded housewife to absolute perfection. Chloe did not even try to hide her blatant disrespect. She leaned heavily into Darius, her long acrylic nails tapping aggressively against the glass table, and openly giggled. She pulled up a high-end digital catalog on her smartphone, intentionally tilting the bright screen so I could see exactly what she was looking at. She whispered loudly enough for the entire room to hear that she was currently picking out imported Italian leather sofas to replace the outdated, boring furniture I had originally chosen for the living room. She pointed to a massive, gaudy crystal chandelier on her screen and told Darius it would look absolutely perfect in their new grand entryway. Darius patted her bare knee, shooting me a quick, arrogant glance to ensure I was adequately absorbing the public humiliation. Harrison, the slick attorney, cleared his throat loudly to command the attention of the room. He slid a thick, aggressively flagged stack of legal documents across the slate table toward Sterling and me. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and adopted a tone of exaggerated, mocking patience. He stated that the paperwork was entirely straightforward and completely non-negotiable. He heavily emphasized the financial waiver clause, reading the dense legal jargon aloud to ensure I understood my total defeat. He made it crystal clear that by signing these specific documents, I was permanently and irrevocably surrendering any and all claims to Darius's current business assets, his future real estate commissions, his diverse bank accounts, and the sprawling Buckhead estate. He tapped his pen against the final page and pointed out the cashier's check for $5,000 resting neatly in a white envelope. He proudly called it a gesture of extreme goodwill from his highly generous client. Sterling picked up the heavy stack of documents and pretended to review them with a deep, frustrated sigh. He leaned over and whispered a few rehearsed words of caution in my ear, putting on a spectacular award-winning show of a defeated lawyer, advising his client to just surrender and take the meager settlement. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the $5,000 check, maintaining my facade of total despair. Darius could not resist the golden opportunity to kick me while he assumed I was lying broken on the ground. He stood up from his expensive leather chair, buttoning his suit jacket with a theatrical, arrogant flourish. He looked down at me from across the wide table, completely unable to contain his dangerously inflated ego. He delivered a condescending, deeply insulting speech that he had likely been practicing in the mirror all morning. He told me that he genuinely felt sorry for my current pathetic situation, but the high-stakes business world of Atlanta was a fast-paced elite arena that ruthlessly left stagnant, unmotivated people behind. He pointed a manicured finger directly at the $5,000 check. He firmly suggested that I take that generous severance and use it to enroll in a basic accounting or administration course at a local community college. He said I desperately needed to learn a practical modern skill so I could eventually stop relying on highly successful men to fund my basic existence. He claimed that if I really applied myself and stopped wallowing in self-pity, I might eventually qualify for a decent entry-level secretarial job somewhere far out in the suburbs, well away from the city's true elite. He stated that real wealth requires a certain pedigree and an aggressive hustle that a former event planner simply did not possess. Chloe let out another sharp, grating laugh, covering her mouth in a fake display of high society politeness. She leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand, and added her own vicious insult to the pile. She suggested that I should probably look into hospitality management instead. She smirked and told me that applying to be a front desk clerk or a housekeeping manager at a mid-tier hotel would be a perfect fit since I was already so incredibly used to cleaning up after people who were vastly superior to me. Every single muscle in my body wanted to react violently. The powerful, highly capable CEO inside me wanted to stand up, grab that pathetic $5,000 check, and shred it into tiny pieces right in front of their arrogant, mocking faces. I wanted to slam my hands on the slate table and scream that I was the new legal owner of the prestigious Oasis Resorts chain. I wanted to watch the blood drain from Chloe's smug face when she realized she was currently sitting in the presence of a woman who could buy and sell her entire bloodline before lunchtime. But I forcefully pushed those hot, reactive emotions down deep into the pit of my stomach. I locked them away behind an impenetrable wall of pure, calculating ice. I focused entirely on the cold, hard logic of the brilliant legal strategy Sterling and I had meticulously crafted. Darius was actively hiding a $40 million mega mansion commercial deal. I was utterly terrified. I would demand my rightful, legally mandated cut of his massive upcoming commission. Because of that blinding, desperate greed, he had forced his high-priced lawyers to draft a marital waiver so aggressively restrictive that it legally obliterated his right to ever touch a single dime of my freshly inherited $55 million fortune. I looked down at the specific clause Harrison had highlighted. The legal text was explicit. It stated that neither party could lay any future claim to any assets, inheritances, trusts, or business revenues acquired independently, regardless of when those assets were fully processed or revealed. It was an ironclad barrier. By eagerly trying to lock me out of his temporary success, Darius was permanently locking himself out of generational wealth. I looked up at Darius, forcing a slight pathetic tremor into my voice. I asked him if this was truly the end of our entire history. I asked him if he was absolutely certain he wanted to sign away everything we had ever shared and walk away without a single ounce of regret. Darius did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He aggressively pushed the sleek silver pen across the table until it stopped right in front of my folded hands. He demanded that I stop whining and sign the papers immediately. He stated that he had massive, highly lucrative commercial deals to close this afternoon and could not waste another minute of his valuable time dealing with my useless emotional baggage. I slowly picked up the heavy silver pen. I let the silence stretch in the cold, bright conference room for 5 agonizing seconds. I stared at the signature line, feeling the immense, absolute power resting right at my fingertips. With one swift, fluid motion, I pressed the dark ink to the paper. I signed my name on the final page of the divorce decree. I signed my name on the comprehensive financial waiver. I signed away my claim to the Buckhead estate, my claim to his fraudulent brokerage firm, and my claim to his pathetic future real estate commissions. And in doing so, I legally, permanently, and irrevocably locked Darius out of my $55 million empire. The fast-track divorce was completely secured. I was officially a free woman, and my fortune was officially untouchable. Harrison eagerly snatched the thick stack of documents back across the table, quickly inspecting my signatures to ensure everything was legally binding and flawless. He nodded sharply to Darius, confirming the complete victory. Darius let out a loud, exaggerated breath of relief, visibly relaxing his tense, broad shoulders. He had done it. He had successfully protected his secret real estate commission from the woman who had funded his entire career. Chloe immediately jumped up from her leather chair, grabbing Darius tightly by the arm and pulling him toward the frosted glass doors. She cheerfully announced that they needed to head straight to the luxury furniture showroom in Midtown to finalize the custom order for their new Italian leather sectional. She giggled again, telling Darius she wanted to celebrate their fresh start with a massive shopping spree using his corporate card. I calmly stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my beige slacks. I picked up my small canvas duffel bag, slinging it over my shoulder. I left the white envelope containing the $5,000 cashier's check sitting entirely untouched on the gray slate table. Sterling stood up right beside me, packing his thin portfolio, his face an impenetrable mask of absolute legal professionalism. As Darius reached the heavy glass door, he paused and turned back to look at me one final time. His fragile ego was fully satiated, his secret wealth seemingly protected, and his new flashy lifestyle officially secured. He casually slipped his hands into his tailored suit pockets. He mentioned with a completely unearned sense of benevolence and superiority that we should probably arrange a civil dinner in a few weeks. He claimed we needed to sit down like rational adults and discuss a cohesive co-parenting strategy for Malik's sake, now that the ugly business was finally concluded. I looked at the man who had just ruthlessly discarded me, the man who had bought my teenage son's loyalty with video game consoles and empty promises of luxury electric vehicles. I felt the immense heavy weight of $55 million resting safely and securely in my own name. I offered Darius a cold, highly secretive smile that did not reach my eyes. I calmly accepted his invitation, telling him I would absolutely love to have dinner soon. 3 weeks passed in a highly productive, meticulously organized blur of corporate restructuring and ironclad legal maneuvers. I had spent every single waking hour locked inside Sterling's high-rise law office, officially stepping into my new role as the sole owner and chief executive officer of the Oasis Resorts chain. I had signed massive vendor contracts, reviewed hundreds of employee portfolios, and began the quiet, systematic takeover of Great Aunt Josephine's legendary hospitality empire. Meanwhile, Darius completely believed I was currently crashing on a friend's cheap sofa, hopelessly scrolling through entry-level job boards. My divorce from Darius was officially finalized in record time, processed exactly as his overpriced attorneys had demanded. The ink on the judge's signature was barely dry when I pulled my newly leased dark-tinted sedan up to the valet stand at Le Petit Chateau, one of Buckhead's most notoriously exclusive and overpriced. I handed the electronic key fob to the eager valet attendant, tipped him generously with a crisp $50 bill, and smoothed the fabric of my tailored navy slacks. I was wearing a simple silk blouse and absolutely zero jewelry. The total lack of flashy accessories was an entirely deliberate choice on my part. I knew exactly what kind of shallow, materialistic performance I was about to walk into tonight, and I was fully prepared to let my ex-husband and his ridiculous entourage play their foolish games. I walked through the heavy mahogany front doors of the restaurant, letting the cool air-conditioned breeze wash over my face. The hostess, a tall woman holding a leather-bound reservation book, immediately recognized the name Darius had provided. She offered a tight, polite smile and escorted me through the dimly lit, opulent dining room, navigating gracefully past tables filled with Atlanta's corporate elite and wealthy socialites. Tucked away in a semi-private red velvet booth at the very back of the restaurant sat the people who had recently constituted my entire family. Darius, Chloe, Tasha, and my 16-year-old son Malik were already seated. They had clearly arrived early to establish dominance over the space and order expensive drinks on his tab. As I approached the table, the visual display of their new wardrobe was absolutely staggering in its sheer desperation. They were practically radiating a toxic, frantic energy that disrupted the refined quiet of the dining room. Darius was wearing a brand new, absurdly flashy velvet tuxedo jacket in a deep emerald green that screamed new money. He had a thick gold watch strapped to his wrist, sitting aggressively over his cuff. Chloe was draped in a skin-tight scarlet designer gown, heavily branded with enormous interlocking logos that made her look like a walking billboard for a luxury fashion house. Tasha was sporting an aggressive neon yellow pantsuit and a thick gold chain necklace that looked incredibly heavy and entirely fake. Even Malik was completely decked out in limited edition designer sneakers and a highly coveted streetwear hoodie that I knew cost well over $2,000 on the resale market. They were dripping in fresh, aggressive wealth. They looked less like a family gathering for a civil dinner and more like a chaotic group of lottery winners who had blindly raided a high-end department store just hours prior to arriving. I slid silently into the empty chair located at the head of the table. No one offered a basic greeting. No one bothered to ask how my transition had been. Darius sat directly across from me, gripping a crystal tumbler of amber liquor. He was sweating slightly under his thick velvet jacket, his eyes darting nervously around the restaurant, as if he were constantly checking his peripheral vision for incoming threats. He downed his drink in one aggressive gulp and immediately signaled the waiter for a refill, acting less like a triumphant winner and more like a man desperately trying to drown his own mounting anxiety. The vicious ambush commenced the exact second I picked up my crisp linen napkin and placed it on my lap. Chloe immediately thrust her left hand across the pristine white tablecloth, aggressively waving her manicured fingers right in front of my face. Sitting heavy and obnoxious on her ring finger was a massive radiant cut diamond engagement ring. The stone was so outrageously large and poorly set that it looked almost comical, catching the low ambient light of the restaurant and throwing aggressive scattered reflections across the room. Chloe giggled a sharp grating sound that forced the patrons at the adjacent table to turn their heads in annoyance. She loudly announced that Darius simply could not wait a single day after the divorce was finalized to make her an honest woman. She twisted her wrist back and forth, ensuring I got a clear, unobstructed view of the diamond from every possible angle. She told me that Darius insisted on buying her the biggest stone in the entire jewelry district because he finally had a young, vibrant partner whose beauty actually matched his elite social standing in the city. She then let her dark eyes drag slowly up and down my simple silk blouse and plain slacks. She scoffed loudly and asked if I had shopped at a discount clearance rack on my way to the restaurant. She stated that I looked incredibly tired and aged, firmly suggesting I use my meager $5,000 divorce settlement to buy some decent makeup to hide the dark bags under my eyes before I tried re-entering the dating pool. Tasha immediately seized the golden opportunity to join the coordinated attack. She leaned heavily over her untouched plate of imported oysters and barked a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed in the private booth. Tasha asked me if I had to thoroughly check the local public bus schedule just to make it to Buckhead tonight. She loudly speculated that I probably had to walk the last 3 miles in my cheap shoes because I could no longer afford a basic luxury rideshare service without Darius funding my lifestyle. She maliciously reminded me that the days of me riding comfortably in Darius's leather passenger seat were permanently over. Tasha told me that I needed to get used to navigating the harsh streets of Atlanta like a regular broke citizen because the gravy train had officially derailed. She picked up a delicate silver cocktail fork and pointed it directly at my chest, loudly proclaiming that I should probably start looking for a uniform because she heard the hotel down the street was desperately hiring overnight cleaning staff. I did not flinch. I did not offer a single defensive remark to counter their pathetic insults. I simply raised my hand to signal. The waiter politely ordered a tall glass of sparkling water with a fresh twist of lime and folded my hands neatly on the table in front of me. I sat there in absolute silence, offering them nothing but a blank, unbothered stare. When my sparkling water arrived, I took a slow, measured sip, relishing the crisp coldness against my throat. I completely ignored their goading and meticulously analyzed their erratic behavior. While they continued to throw childish jabs, my sharp analytical mind was calculating complex financial numbers at lightning speed. Something about this entire flashy setup felt fundamentally wrong. I knew Darius's financial portfolio inside and out. Even with his impending $40 million mega mansion deal, that specific real estate commission was not supposed to hit his corporate banking accounts for at least another 3 weeks. The closing process on commercial properties of that massive magnitude required rigorous legal auditing, extensive title searches, and massive escrow clearances before a single cent was dispersed to the managing brokers. Yet Darius was sitting here acting like he had just liquidated an offshore gold mine. The massive diamond resting on Chloe's finger had to cost upward of $80,000 if the stone was authentic. The loud designer outfits currently draped across Tasha Malik and Chloe represented at least another $40,000 in immediate retail spending. Darius had clearly footed the bill for this highly exclusive dinner, casually ordering vintage champagne and expensive imported caviar before I even arrived at the restaurant. Where was this sudden massive surge of liquid cash coming from? Darius was famously over-leveraged throughout our entire marriage. He lived paycheck to paycheck, constantly relying on the next property closing just to pay off the massive suffocating credit card debt from his previous flashy purchases. He did not have $150,000 in spare, untraceable cash just sitting idle in a checking account. He was spending money with a reckless, frantic velocity that defied all standard financial logic and broke every rule of real estate wealth management. It was not just arrogant spending. It was the desperate, uncontrolled bleeding of cash that usually accompanied massive hidden fraud. My intuition, honed by years of managing complex corporate budgets, told me that Darius was funding this fake lifestyle with money that did not actually belong to him. I watched Chloe lean over to Malik, treating my son more like a high school peer than a stepchild. She pulled up a picture of a sleek black Tesla on her phone screen, enthusiastically pointing out the custom white leather interior they were supposedly going to order for him. Malik grinned, entirely blinded by the aggressive materialism being spoon-fed to him. Before I could dissect Darius's bizarre financial timeline any further, the thick tension at the table violently snapped. Malik, who had been aggressively ignoring me while texting on his brand-new smartphone, suddenly threw his device down. The screen cracked slightly against the edge of a porcelain plate, but he did not even flinch. He slammed both of his hands hard against the solid oak dining table, causing the crystal water goblets to rattle dangerously and spilling a few drops of champagne onto the white linen. Malik glared directly at Darius, his teenage face twisted in spoiled entitlement. He raised his voice, drawing the irritated stares of the surrounding tables, demanding to know right now exactly who was paying the $20,000 invoice for his elite summer sports camp. The entire table went dead silent as Malik's outburst shattered the smug, celebratory atmosphere. The total cost for his highly exclusive out-of-state summer sports camp was a staggering $20,000, but the immediate non-refundable securing deposit of $5,000 was due by midnight tonight. Malik glared directly at his father, his teenage entitlement radiating from every single pore. He crossed his arms over his expensive streetwear hoodie, demanding that Darius produce his black card and handle the invoice immediately. He argued that if they were truly operating at the highest tier of Atlanta society, a simple $5,000 deposit should be an absolute afterthought. Darius did not reach for his wallet. Instead, a slow, malicious grin spread across his face. He leaned back against the plush red velvet booth, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. He saw a golden opportunity to humiliate me further in front of his new audience. Darius raised his hand, gesturing lazily across the table directly at me. He told Malik that he was a highly successful, modern man who believed in equal parenting responsibilities. He adopted a tone of fake, exaggerated fairness. He said that since he had generously carried the entire financial burden of this family for a decade, it was officially time for my mother to step up and contribute to her son's athletic future. Darius let out a low, booming laugh. He turned to Chloe, sharing a deeply mocking look. He loudly reminded the entire table that I had just received a very generous, extremely fair severance check of exactly $5,000 from his high-powered attorneys earlier that month. He told Malik to ask his independent, newly single mother to hand over her entire divorce settlement to fund his summer camp. Darius knew perfectly well that standard protocol for a discarded unemployed housewife would dictate hoarding that tiny severance just to afford basic groceries and a cheap studio apartment. He was intentionally putting me on the spot, actively trying to force me to admit my complete financial ruin in front of the very son he had stolen from me. Tasha immediately chimed in, clapping her hands together in sheer delight. She leaned over the table, her heavy fake gold chains clanking against the porcelain plates. She mockingly cheered me on, telling me to pull out my checkbook and show the boy how a real independent woman handles her business. Chloe giggled behind her hand, her massive, fraudulently purchased diamond flashing under the restaurant lights. They were circling me like vultures, eagerly waiting for me to break down, cry, or beg Darius to just pay the invoice and spare me the public humiliation. I looked at Malik. I looked deep into the eyes of the boy I had carried, nurtured, and sacrificed my entire career to raise. I searched his face for any lingering trace of empathy, any small sign that he recognized the utter cruelty of his father's game. But Malik just stared at me with a cold, hard expectancy. He held out his hand, palm up, waiting for me to magically produce the cash. I did not care about my survival. He did not care if handing over my last $5,000 meant I would be sleeping on the streets of Atlanta tonight. He only cared about his elite sports camp and maintaining his fragile status among his wealthy private school friends. The seasoned CEO inside me took complete control of the situation. I realized this was the final defining test of my son's character. I needed to see exactly how far his morality had decayed under Darius's toxic influence. I calmly reached down and picked up my understated, elegant leather purse. I unclasped the hardware with a soft click. The table leaned in collectively, practically holding their breath, waiting to see what pathetic excuse I was about to offer. I bypassed my checkbook entirely. I reached into my wallet and pulled out a single crisp $100 bill. I placed the green bill flat on the pristine white linen tablecloth. I placed my index finger on the center of the bill and slowly, deliberately slid it across the table until it rested directly in front of Malik's outstretched hand. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice entirely devoid of any maternal warmth or emotional pleading. I stated clearly and calmly that this was all I could give him right now. It was a statement layered with absolute brilliant truth. Legally and financially, I was the sole owner of a $55 million liquid fortune. I could have easily bought the entire sports camp facility and fired the directors before the appetizer plates were cleared. But morally and ethically, a single $100 bill was the absolute maximum investment I was willing to make in a young man who treated his own mother like a disposable ATM. For 2 seconds, the table was completely silent. Then an absolute eruption of cruel, vindictive laughter exploded from Darius, Chloe, and Tasha. Darius threw his head back, roaring with laughter so hard he actually had to wipe a tear of mirth from his eye. Tasha slapped the oak table, howling that I was offering the boy literal pocket change to fund a luxury lifestyle. Chloe leaned against Darius's shoulder, mocking my gesture as the most pathetic, embarrassing display of poverty she had ever witnessed in her entire life. She asked Malik if he planned to buy a single pair of shoelaces with his mother's grand contribution. Malik did not laugh. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. He looked at the crisp $100 bill as if I had just slid a piece of rotting garbage across the fine dining table. His teenage entitlement flared into aggressive anger. He snatched the $100 bill off the white linen and violently crumpled it into a tight ball in his fist. He shoved his arm forward and threw the crumpled bill aggressively back at my chest. It bounced off my silk blouse and landed silently on my lap. "I told me to keep my pathetic spare change." He sneered, his upper lip curling in deep revulsion. He loudly declared that I was a complete embarrassment to his entire existence. He said he did not need my useless handouts because he had a father who actually knew how to generate real wealth. He turned away from me, completely shifting his chair to physically block me out of his line of sight, and aggressively demanded that Darius just pay the invoice so they could stop dealing with the local charity case. Darius smirked triumphantly, pulling out a heavy black metal credit card and tossing it onto the table to appease the boy. He had won the psychological war, or so he foolishly believed. He had successfully orchestrated my total alienation from my only child. Chloe saw the golden opportunity to deliver the final killing blow of the evening. She wanted to ensure I left this restaurant feeling smaller than an insect. She reached down into her heavily branded oversized designer tote bag. She dramatically pulled out a thick, heavy envelope. The cardstock was incredibly expensive, a deep midnight black with thick gold foil lining the edges. She held it up between her manicured fingers, letting the ambient lighting catch the metallic sheen of the extravagant stationery. She slid the heavy envelope deliberately across the table. It made a soft hissing sound against the tablecloth until it stopped right next to my glass of sparkling water. I did not reach for it. I simply looked at it, maintaining my impenetrable mask of calm detachment. Chloe proudly announced what it was. She loudly declared that it was an exclusive VIP invitation to the official launch gala for Darius's brand new $40 million mega mansion commercial project. She puffed out her chest, bragging to the adjacent tables that Darius was about to single-handedly reshape the entire luxury housing market of the northern suburbs. She claimed this event was going to be the most talked-about corporate gala of the entire Atlanta social season. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, her eyes glinting with pure malicious intent. She smirked, a vicious, ugly expression that perfectly highlighted the absolute rottenness of her character. She told me that they had booked the venue at the Oasis Grand Atlanta. My heart gave a single powerful and deeply satisfying thud inside my chest. The Oasis Grand Atlanta. Chloe continued her arrogant rambling, completely unaware that she was digging her own grave with every single word. She bragged that they had secured the Crystal Ballroom, the most premium, highly restricted, and phenomenally expensive event space in the entire hotel. She said the deposit alone cost more than I would probably earn in the next 20 years of my miserable life. She enthusiastically invited me to attend. She told me I should absolutely come and stand in the back of the room just to see how real elites actually operate in the corporate world. Then she delivered her final pathetic insult. She tilted her head, feigning mock sympathy. She told me that she had heard the hotel management was currently restructuring their staffing departments. She giggled and suggested that if I showed up early, I might be able to secure a job handing out mints and warm towels as a bathroom attendant for their wealthy guests. Tasha cackled loudly in agreement, telling me to make sure I wore a comfortable uniform if I planned on scrubbing floors all night. I slowly lowered my eyes from Chloe's arrogant face down to the heavy black envelope resting on the table. The gold-embossed logo of the Oasis Grand Atlanta gleamed brightly against the white linen. It was the exact same logo that was currently printed on the top of my brand new corporate letterhead. It was the exact same logo etched into the heavy glass doors of the executive penthouse suite I now legally occupied. They were bragging about renting a single ballroom inside a towering skyscraper that I had legally assumed total unyielding ownership of just 48 hours ago. The sheer profound cosmic irony of the situation was intoxicating. Darius was funding this extravagant fake lifestyle with embezzled money, and he was planning to celebrate his fraudulent mega mansion project inside a building owned by the very woman he had just ruthlessly discarded. He was essentially planning to throw a massive party inside my own living room, completely blind to the fact that I held the master keys to the entire kingdom. I did not break my composure. I did not reveal a single ounce of the lethal power currently coursing through my veins. I calmly reached out and picked up the heavy black envelope. I ran my thumb smoothly over the gold foil lettering, feeling the thick, expensive texture of the cardstock. I slowly opened my understated leather purse and slipped the invitation safely inside, snapping the hardware shut with a definitive sharp click. I stood up from the red velvet booth. I smoothed the front of my silk blouse, entirely ignoring the crumpled $100 bill that fell from my lap onto the floor. I looked directly into Chloe's mocking eyes, and then I shifted my gaze to meet Darius's arrogant, triumphant stare. I did not look at Malik or Tasha. I focused entirely on the two architects of this massive, fraudulent illusion. I let a soft, chilling, and highly secretive smile cross my face. I spoke with absolute, unwavering certainty, my voice slicing cleanly through the ambient noise of the busy restaurant. I told them I wouldn't miss it for the world. I turned my back on the booth and walked away. I strode through the opulent dining room of Le Petit Chateau with the graceful, commanding presence of a woman who fully recognized her own supreme worth. I left them sitting there laughing into their expensive champagne glasses, completely and utterly oblivious to the fact that they had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to orchestrate their absolute, very public destruction on my own territory. The morning sun broke across the sprawling Atlanta skyline, casting long, brilliant golden reflections against the towering multi-story glass facade of the Oasis Grand. I stepped out of my sleek, dark-tinted sedan and handed the electronic key fob to the valet attendant. I was no longer the exhausted, accommodating woman clutching a small canvas duffel bag on a suburban front porch. I was no longer the discarded housewife who had quietly endured years of financial manipulation and emotional neglect. Today, I wore a sharply tailored charcoal gray designer power suit, paired with a pristine white silk blouse and a pair of formidable red-soled stiletto heels. I walked purposefully through the heavy revolving brass doors of the hotel, instantly feeling the profound, undeniable shift in the atmosphere. The main lobby of the Oasis Grand was an absolute masterclass in modern luxury and refined Southern elegance. The space featured soaring 30-foot ceilings, imported white marble floors that gleamed like glass, and massive cascading crystal chandeliers that threw fractured light across the bustling room. The air smelled faintly of expensive sandalwood, fresh orchids, and old money. I bypassed the crowded reception desk entirely, completely ignoring the long lines of wealthy guests and eager tourists. I walked straight toward a discreet, unmarked elevator bank, tucked behind a wall of dark mahogany paneling, an entrance reserved exclusively for upper executive staff. I reached into my designer purse and pulled out the heavy, black biometric keycard Sterling had securely handed me late last night. I swiped the card against the glowing digital reader. The heavy brushed steel doors slid open silently, and I keyed in the absolute top floor. The private high-speed elevator shot upward, leaving the chaotic noise of the main lobby far behind in an instant. When the doors finally parted, I stepped directly into the expansive executive penthouse suite. The space was utterly breathtaking, walled entirely by floor-to-ceiling glass windows that offered a panoramic, commanding view of the entire city of Atlanta. Sitting around a massive, polished mahogany conference table were 12 men and women dressed in highly expensive, conservative corporate attire. These were the senior executives, regional directors, and legacy board members who had been comfortably running the Oasis Resorts chain on autopilot since my great aunt first fell ill. Standing at the head of the long table, projecting his usual aura of absolute unyielding authority, was Sterling. He checked his heavy gold watch, gave me a brief, deeply approving nod, and cleared his throat loudly to command the immediate attention of the room. The low murmurs around the heavy mahogany table instantly died down. 12 pairs of sharply evaluating eyes turned to lock directly onto me. I could clearly see the silent, arrogant calculations flashing across their faces. Some looked highly skeptical, clearly expecting a naive, inexperienced, grieving relative who would blindly sign whatever complex legal documents they placed in front of her. Others looked nervously guarded, unsure of how my sudden arrival would impact their lucrative compensation packages. Sterling stood tall, adjusting his tailored suit jacket, and formally introduced me to the room. He stated with crystal-clear, absolute precision that the extensive probate process was entirely concluded. The transition of corporate power was legally absolute, and I was now the sole owner, majority shareholder, and incoming chief executive officer of the entire Oasis Hotel Group. I did not wait for their polite, scattered, and highly reluctant applause. I walked with deliberate, measured steps directly to the heavy, high-backed leather chair situated at the very head of the table. I placed my hands flat on the polished wood and looked intently at the empty seat that had once belonged to Great Aunt Josephine. Josephine had built this immense, sprawling hospitality empire during the absolute height of the civil rights era. At a time when Black women in the deeply segregated South were aggressively marginalized, systematically dismissed, and violently denied basic commercial financial loans, Josephine had completely defied the odds. She had leveraged a very small hard-earned family inheritance, outsmarted violently racist competitors, and ruthlessly fought her way into the highly elite male-dominated commercial real estate market. She had fiercely faced down corrupt local politicians, hostile city developers, and a society that desperately wanted her to fail and disappear. She did not ever shrink herself to make arrogant, mediocre men feel comfortable. She built massive walls of pure, unbreakable steel. As I stood there, I felt her powerful, unyielding spirit wash completely over me, settling deep into my bones. The weak, overly accommodating housewife, who had spent 10 years buffering Darius's fragile, toxic ego, was entirely dead and buried. I channeled Josephine's legendary iron will, pulling her immense historic strength directly into my own posture. I took my rightful seat at the head of the table, folding my hands perfectly in front of me, and met the gaze of every single executive in the room with eyes as cold as winter ice. I did not offer a warm, friendly greeting to ease their visible tension. I did not assure them that the daily corporate operations were going to remain unchanged. Instead, I opened the thick, heavy leather binder I had spent the entire sleepless night thoroughly analyzing. I began my tenure with absolute surgical ruthlessness. I looked directly at the vice president of operations, a complacent, visibly overpaid executive who had been lazily coasting on grossly inflated expense accounts for the last 3 years. I calmly cited 3 specific highly disastrous vendor contracts. He had recently approved contracts that were blatantly bleeding the company's profit margins just to benefit his personal, underqualified associates. He opened his mouth, his face flushing red as he attempted to stammer out a loud defensive excuse about standard industry practices. I raised a single finger, silencing him instantly. I told him his pathetic justifications were an insult to my intelligence, that his services were no longer required, and instructed him to clear out his office desk before noon today. A collective, terrified gasp echoed through the sterile conference room as the vice president forcefully pushed his chair back and stormed out in sheer humiliation. I then turned my sharp attention to the regional director of marketing. I systematically exposed her deeply flawed, stagnant promotional campaigns that had consistently allowed our luxury competitors to gain massive market share in our highly profitable coastal resort locations. I detailed her failure to capture the modern elite demographic and fired her right on the spot, completely ignoring her shocked, tearful protests. Within exactly 20 minutes, I had systematically terminated 4 of the highest paid, most notoriously corrupt senior executives sitting at that table. I watched the remaining board members turn completely pale, their previous arrogant skepticism entirely replaced by sheer, undeniable terror. They suddenly realized they were dealing with an apex predator. I closed my thick leather binder with a sharp, definitive snap that made several executives visibly flinch. I stated in a low, dangerous tone that the era of corporate complacency, lazy oversight, and bloated expense accounts was officially over. I demanded absolute perfection, ruthless efficiency, and unyielding loyalty to the rigorous new standard of excellence I was establishing today. Anyone who failed to meet that standard would join their former colleagues in the unemployment line by the end of the week. I then called the general manager of the Oasis Grand Atlanta, a sharp, highly observant man named Caldwell, to the front of the room. I also summoned the head of hotel security, Chief Davis, a towering, fiercely loyal veteran of the armed forces who carried himself with intense discipline. I looked them both directly in the eyes. I informed them that as the premier flagship property of my entire nationwide empire, this specific hotel would operate under my direct, uncompromising daily supervision. I told Caldwell and Davis that I required their absolute, unquestioning loyalty above all else. I established strict new operational protocols right there on the spot. I mandated that every single high-tier event contract, every elite VIP guest list, and every major financial transaction moving through this building had to cross my desk for final personal approval. Caldwell and Davis stood at strict attention, recognizing immediately that they were dealing with a leader who would not tolerate a single ounce of insubordination or failure. They swore their absolute allegiance to me without hesitation, confirming that my word was the final undeniable law inside the towering glass walls of the Oasis Grand. I dismissed the terrified, newly compliant board of directors, instructing them to return to their respective departments and immediately implement my aggressive new operational standards. As the heavy frosted glass doors closed behind them, the massive executive penthouse grew incredibly quiet. Only Sterling and the newly appointed financial director, a meticulous, highly numbers-driven woman named Monroe, remained in the room. I stood up and walked over to the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the sprawling, bustling metropolis of Atlanta. The city looked entirely different from this towering, dominant vantage point. It looked like a massive, intricate chessboard, and I finally controlled the most powerful pieces on the board. I turned away from the gleaming glass and walked back to the mahogany table. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out the heavy black and gold embossed envelope Chloe had smugly slid across the table at the restaurant just 12 hours prior. I tossed the extravagant invitation onto the polished wood directly in front of Director Monroe. The shiny gold foil lettering glinted harshly under the bright overhead lighting. I instructed Monroe to immediately access the hotel's highly encrypted corporate event booking servers. I told her I needed her to pull the exact event contract, the third-party vendor agreements, and the complete unredacted financial billing details for the upcoming luxury real estate launch party hosted by Darius and his brokerage firm. I kept my voice incredibly calm, but a lethal, highly calculated edge sharpened every single syllable I spoke. I explained to Sterling and Monroe that a desperately over-leveraged man who was aggressively begging for a fast-track divorce to hide his assets did not suddenly possess the massive liquid capital required to rent the Crystal Ballroom and throw the most expensive, lavish corporate gala of the entire Atlanta social season. I told Monroe that I needed to see the raw, unfiltered financial data right now. I needed to see the exact banking routing numbers, the hidden escrow accounts, and the concealed corporate ledgers Darius was using to fund this extravagant illusion. I looked down at the black and gold invitation resting on my boardroom table, a dark, vengeful smile slowly spreading across my face. I needed to see exactly how my cheating, arrogant ex-husband and his materialistic mistress were secretly funding their fake, fraudulent lifestyle because I was going to use his own sloppy financial records to completely bury him alive. Director Monroe did not waste a single second. Her manicured fingers flew across the sleek backlit keyboard of her executive terminal with ruthless efficiency. The massive flat-screen monitor mounted on the wall of the penthouse boardroom instantly flared to life, casting a stark, bright blue glow across the polished mahogany table. Sterling stood perfectly still beside me, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his sharp legal mind already calculating the potential avenues of liability. I kept my eyes locked on the digital display as a highly detailed, comprehensive corporate dossier rapidly materialized on the screen. The luxurious black and gold invitation resting on the table had provided us with the exact date, the specific venue, and the primary corporate sponsor for the upcoming gala. That was all the leverage Monroe needed to completely bypass the standard firewall and drill directly into the hotel's elite vendor billing system. The primary contract for the Crystal Ballroom loaded onto the screen. I scanned the itemized invoice with the practiced, meticulous eye of a seasoned event planner. Darius and Chloe had absolutely spared no expense for their grand illusion. They had aggressively ordered premium vintage champagne, imported beluga, caviar stations towering floral centerpieces, and a specialized lighting rig designed to project their brokerage logo across the soaring walls of the ballroom. The total estimated cost for the single evening of lavish entertainment exceeded a staggering $200,000. Monroe highlighted the initial deposit block. A non-refundable payment of $75,000 had been successfully wired to the Oasis Grand corporate accounts exactly 4 days ago. I leaned closer to the high-resolution monitor, narrowing my eyes at the banking routing numbers attached to that massive wire transfer. Something was fundamentally, undeniably wrong with the transaction data. Darius operated a boutique luxury brokerage. Standard industry protocol dictated that major marketing events were funded through a designated corporate operating account, an account that I had personally established and managed for him years ago. But the $75,000 deposit had not originated from his primary operating funds. It had been wired from a completely unfamiliar, highly restricted secondary banking tier. I instructed Monroe to isolate that specific routing number and trace the origin of the funds. Sterling immediately authorized the deep dive, utilizing his extensive legal credentials to cross-reference the hotel's secure vendor vetting software with public financial registries. The digital paper trail unraveled with shocking speed. The money had not come from a marketing budget. It had not come from Darius's personal savings. The $75,000 had been aggressively siphoned directly out of a highly protected client escrow account. A profound, chilling silence descended upon the executive boardroom. In the cutthroat, highly regulated world of luxury real estate, touching a client escrow account for personal or promotional use was not just a minor ethical violation. It was a massive career-ending federal crime. It was the absolute fastest way to lose a broker's license and face severe prison time. Sterling stepped forward, his expression hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated disbelief. He instructed Monroe to expand the search parameters, ordering her to pull every single public filing zoning permit and land deed associated with Darius's highly publicized $40 million mega mansion project in the northern suburbs. We waited in tense, heavy silence as the sophisticated software aggressively scraped the county and state databases. The results returned an absolute devastating blank. There were no commercial zoning permits filed in the northern suburbs under Darius's name or his brokerage firm. There were no land acquisition deeds recorded. There were no architectural retainers, no environmental impact studies, and no construction contracts. The sprawling, ultra-luxury mega mansion development that Darius had been aggressively boasting about to the entire Atlanta social elite simply did not exist. It was a complete fabricated ghost project built entirely on thin air and arrogant lies. The sheer monumental scale of his fraud rapidly crystallized in my mind. Darius was not rushing our fast-track divorce to protect a massive impending commission check. He was frantically rushing the divorce because his entire real estate empire was actively imploding, and he desperately needed to legally sever our financial ties before the federal authorities inevitably kicked down his office doors. He had been heavily leveraging imaginary equity for months. He was aggressively collecting massive upfront deposits from eager, wealthy Atlanta investors who believed they were securing prime lots in a highly exclusive new development. I was then taking that fresh incoming cash and illegally using it to pay off the furious early investors from his previous failed real estate ventures. Darius was operating a desperate textbook Ponzi scheme. His brokerage firm was not ascending to the highest tier of Atlanta society. It was weeks, possibly mere days away from a catastrophic, utterly destructive bankruptcy. But the financial autopsy was not even close to being finished. I instructed Monroe to dig deeper into the specific escrow account that had funded the Crystal Ballroom deposit. I needed to see exactly who was authorizing these highly illegal wire transfers. The digital ledger loaded, revealing a frantic, chaotic history of massive unauthorized withdrawals over the past 6 months. I traced the digital signature attached to every single fraudulent transaction. It was not Darius's signature. The digital authorization codes matched Chloe's employee credentials. The 26-year-old mistress who had smirked at me on my front porch, the woman who proudly declared that she understood generational wealth, was actively bleeding her older lover's brokerage firm, completely dry. I stared at the itemized list of illegal withdrawals, feeling a cold, razor-sharp sense of vindication piercing through my veins. There was a withdrawal for exactly $82,000 wired directly to a notoriously expensive high-end jeweler in the Diamond District. That transaction corresponded perfectly with the massive radiant-cut engagement ring Chloe had so aggressively flaunted in my face during our disastrous dinner at Le Petit Chateau. There was a separate, highly specific withdrawal for $2,500 wired directly to a premium electronics retailer. That was the exact cost of the brand new, highly sought after PS5 console and the accompanying luxury accessories she had used to completely buy my teenage son's loyalty. Chloe had systematically embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from innocent, trusting real estate clients. She had stolen their hard-earned escrow funds to purchase her flashy designer wardrobe, her oversized engagement ring, and the pathetic materialistic bribes she used to manipulate Malik. Darius was likely entirely oblivious to the specific granular details of her rampant escrow theft. How was a man so fiercely blinded by his own towering ego, so desperate to maintain his fake wealthy facade that he had blindly trusted a manipulative, opportunistic subordinate with unrestricted access to his financial accounts? I thought he was grooming a brilliant young real estate protege. In reality, he was harboring a ruthless parasite who was aggressively accelerating his total financial destruction. I stood up from the mahogany table, my entire body buzzing with lethal, absolute power. I looked at the highly incriminating financial reports displayed on the massive monitor. I had walked into this executive suite hoping to find a minor discrepancy or a hidden banking account. Instead, I had just unearthed a massive smoking gun that would guarantee their absolute inescapable imprisonment. Sterling looked at me, his dark eyes wide with sheer professional shock. He stated that we needed to immediately contact the federal authorities. He advised that handing this massive trove of evidence over to the Real Estate Commission and the Financial Fraud Division would instantly trigger a sweeping federal raid on Darius's brokerage firm. He said we could have both Darius and Chloe arrested and detained before the sun went down today. I slowly shook my head, rejecting his logical, highly standard legal advice. I reached across the desk and picked up the heavy gold-embossed invitation to the launch gala. I traced the raised lettering with my index finger, an icy, unyielding smile settling onto my features. I told Sterling that calling the authorities right now would be a monumental waste of a perfectly orchestrated stage. If Darius and Chloe were arrested in the quiet privacy of their office today, they would immediately hire sleazy defense attorneys. They would aggressively spin the narrative, playing the victims of a complex accounting error, and desperately try to salvage their shattered reputations in the media. They would hide behind closed doors and avoid the visceral, agonizing humiliation they so richly deserved. I instructed Monroe to immediately print every single page of the forensic audit. I demanded hard physical copies of the forged escrow transfers, the non-existent zoning permits, the fraudulent vendor routing numbers, and the highly specific receipts for Chloe's diamond ring and Malik's video game console. Monroe scrambled to comply, the high-speed corporate printer whirring aggressively in the corner of the room. When the thick, heavy stack of highly incriminating evidence was placed in my hands, I walked directly over to the biometric wall safe, concealed behind a beautiful abstract painting in the executive suite. I placed my thumb against the glowing digital scanner. The heavy steel door clicked open. I placed the massive stack of financial ruins securely inside the reinforced vault and slammed the heavy door shut, locking it with absolute finality. I turned back to Sterling and Monroe, my voice dropping to a low, commanding register that left absolutely no room for debate or hesitation. I firmly stated that the launch gala was scheduled for tomorrow night. I said Darius and Chloe had invited the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta's elite society to witness their supposed triumph. They had invited wealthy investors, high-profile local politicians, and the most influential socialites in the entire state to stand inside the Crystal Ballroom and celebrate a fake fraudulent empire. I picked up the dedicated executive phone line and dialed the direct extension for Caldwell, the general manager of the Oasis Grand. He answered immediately with crisp, unwavering professionalism. I issued a strict, non-negotiable directive. I commanded Caldwell to let the event setup proceed exactly as planned. I ordered him to ensure the champagne was chilled. The expensive floral arrangements were perfectly displayed, and the red carpet was rolled out to the exact millimeter they had requested. I told him to instruct the entire hotel security team to stand down and observe treating Darius and Chloe with the utmost accommodating respect when they arrived to oversee the ballroom preparations. I hung up the phone and looked out at the breathtaking Atlanta skyline, the city where my ex-husband thought he reigned supreme. I was not going to arrest them in the shadows. I was going to let them put on their expensive designer clothes, walk down the red carpet, and stand proudly under the glaring spotlights. I was going to let them gather every single important investor and socialite in the city into one beautifully decorated room. I had the absolute undeniable proof of their federal crimes locked safely inside my vault. I was going to let the extravagant multi-thousand-dollar party proceed exactly as they had aggressively demanded. The trap was flawlessly set, the bait was taken, and I was entirely prepared to execute the most public, devastating destruction Atlanta high society had ever witnessed. The following evening arrived with a thick electric energy settling over the entire city of Atlanta. The Oasis Grand was completely transformed into a blinding spectacle of superficial wealth and aggressive excess. Massive floodlights swept across the dark night sky, illuminating the towering glass facade of the prestigious hotel. A long, plush red carpet stretched from the busy street directly up to the grand brass doors lined on both sides by heavy velvet ropes and an army of flashing cameras. The Crystal Ballroom was already packed to maximum capacity, with the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta's black elite. Wealthy investors, highly influential local politicians, and prominent socialites mingled under the cascading crystal chandeliers, entirely unaware that they were aggressively celebrating a massive hollow fraud. Standing right at the highly restricted VIP entrance, acting like absolute royalty, were Darius and Chloe. Darius was wearing a sharp, custom-tailored velvet tuxedo, holding a glass of premium vintage champagne, and shaking hands with major city developers. He was flashing his brilliant practice smile, aggressively selling the illusion of his $40 million mega mansion project to anyone who would listen. Chloe stood tightly by his side, practically bursting out of a heavily sequined designer gown. She was deliberately positioning her hand to make sure every single photographer captured the massive embezzled diamond sitting on her finger. Tasha was lingering right behind them, holding a crystal flute and loudly bragging to passing guests about her brother's incredible real estate empire. Even Malik was there, dressed in an immaculate, highly expensive suit, soaking up the fake, unearned adoration of the crowd. They looked completely invincible, entirely intoxicated by the stolen power they falsely believed they possessed. At exactly 9 o'clock, a sleek midnight black chauffeur-driven Maybach pulled smoothly up to the very front of the red carpet. The massive, heavy vehicle commanded immediate, undeniable attention from the entire street. The flashing cameras instantly pivoted away from Darius and Chloe, sensing the sudden arrival of a true, undeniable heavyweight in the Atlanta social scene. The uniformed driver quickly stepped out, walking smartly around the vehicle to open the heavy rear door. I stepped out onto the plush red carpet. I did not look like the exhausted, discarded housewife they had mocked just a few weeks ago on a suburban front porch. I looked like absolute, unyielding power incarnate. I was wearing a breathtaking, custom-tailored haute couture gown crafted from deep midnight blue silk that moved like liquid glass around my ankles. The structured bodice projected fierce, undeniable authority, while the dramatic, sweeping train commanded the physical space around me with every single step. But the true masterpiece of my ensemble rested against my collarbone. I was wearing millions of dollars in flawless vintage diamonds pulled directly from Great Aunt Josephine's highly secured private vault. The massive, brilliant cut stones caught the aggressive glare of the flashing cameras, throwing blinding, sharp prisms of pure white light across the crowded entrance. I wore no other accessories, letting the immense, historic weight of Josephine's legacy speak entirely for itself. The loud, chaotic chatter of the red carpet instantly died down into a stunned, breathless silence. The heavy, intimidating aura of absolute generational wealth radiated from my every single movement. The influential socialites and wealthy investors instinctively stepped backward, the massive crowd parting naturally to create a wide, clear path for my arrival. I walked up the red carpet with slow, measured, and highly calculated steps. My spine was forged from solid steel, my chin held high, my eyes locked dead ahead toward the brass doors of my hotel. I completely owned the ground I was walking on because legally and financially, I literally possessed the deed to the entire city block. It took exactly 10 seconds for Chloe to spot me walking up the red carpet. The smug, triumphant smile completely vanished from her heavily contoured face, instantly replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated panic and vicious rage. She dropped her champagne glass in sheer shock. The delicate crystal shattered loudly against the polished marble floor near the entrance, sending expensive liquor splashing across the pristine shoes of a nearby investor, but she did not even flinch. She grabbed Darius aggressively by the arm, her long acrylic nails digging sharply into his custom tuxedo jacket, and pointed a shaking finger directly at my approaching figure. Darius turned his head, his confident posture completely crumbling the exact second his eyes registered my presence. The color violently drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and terrified. He stared at the vintage diamonds resting against my skin, his greedy, calculating mind entirely unable to process how the broke woman he had just ruthlessly discarded was currently wearing a fortune that eclipsed his entire fake real estate commission. Chloe completely lost her mind. She lunged forward against the heavy velvet ropes, her voice rising into a sharp, hysterical screech that echoed loudly over the ambient music drifting out from the gala. She aggressively pointed at me, her face flushed red with unhinged fury and deep-seated insecurity. She screamed at the top of her lungs, demanding the immediate attention of the hotel staff and anyone within earshot. She ordered them to get the broke, jealous ex-wife out of the building right now. She wildly shouted to the elite crowd that I was a pathetic, delusional stalker who was obsessively trespassing on their private, highly exclusive event. She loudly proclaimed that I was just a bitter, unemployed housewife trying to desperately ruin the most important night of Darius's life, because I could not handle being replaced by a younger, vastly superior woman. Her voice cracked with desperate hostility as she demanded that someone remove the trash from her red carpet. Tasha immediately jumped forward to back up the mistress, eager to deliver another round of her vicious classist insults to protect her brother's fragile ego. Tasha leaned heavily over the velvet rope, barking a harsh, mocking laugh that sounded desperate and shrill. She loudly pointed at my neck and screamed to the wealthy investors nearby that my jewelry was absolutely fake. She confidently declared that I was wearing good, cheap knockoffs I had probably purchased from a discount mall just to violently embarrass myself in front of Atlanta's true high society. Tasha sneered, telling me that put cheap rhinestones on a glorified maid did not suddenly make her a queen. She ordered me to turn around and walk back to the bus stop before I humiliated myself any further. Darius stood completely frozen, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound escaping his lips. He looked deeply terrified, caught entirely off guard by my transformation. He was unsure if he should aggressively command me to leave or quietly beg me not to cause a massive scene in front of the wealthy clients he was currently trying to defraud. Malik stared at me from the background, his teenage face contorted in utter shock. He was completely unable to reconcile the powerful diamond-draped billionaire walking up the carpet with the defeated mother he had cruelly abandoned in our living room for a video game console. His eyes were wide, darting nervously between the dazzling diamonds on my neck and his father's panicked, sweating face. I did not stop walking. I did not break my stride, and I did not acknowledge their pathetic, screeching insults. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from the heavy velvet ropes, looking down at Chloe and Tasha, with eyes as cold and unforgiving as a winter storm. My absolute impenetrable silence infuriated Chloe even more. She felt her power slipping away in front of the very audience she was trying to impress. She turned away from me and frantically began waving her arms at the heavy security presence stationed just inside the grand brass doors. She aggressively demanded that they do their jobs, physically tackle me, and violently throw me out onto the public street where I belonged. She shouted that she had paid a massive deposit for this venue and demanded immediate aggressive action against the trespasser ruining her perfect night. From the shadows of the grand opulent lobby, heavy synchronized footsteps echoed sharply against the marble floor. 6 heavily armed massive hotel security guards marched out through the brass doors in a strict, highly disciplined formation. They were dressed in impeccable black tactical suits, their expressions carved from solid stone radiating an intense, deeply intimidating authority. Leading the tactical unit was Chief Davis, his posture rigid and commanding. Walking right beside him was Caldwell, the impeccably dressed general manager of the Oasis Grand Atlanta. The sheer force of their arrival made the surrounding crowd step back in hushed awe. Chloe let out a loud, triumphant cackle, firmly believing her demands had just been answered. She crossed her arms over her sequined chest, shooting me a vicious, deeply arrogant smirk. She loudly thanked the security team for finally arriving to take out the garbage. She took a confident step back, eagerly anticipating the violent public humiliation she assumed was about to unfold. She fully expected these massive armed men to forcefully grab my arms, drag me kicking and screaming down the plush red carpet, and toss me aggressively into the busy Atlanta street traffic. She looked at Darius, seeking his approval for her ruthless command over the hotel staff. The security team marched directly toward me with unwavering purpose. The elite crowd held their collective breath, watching the intense high-stakes drama unfold under the bright floodlights. But as Chief Davis and his 6 heavily armed guards reached the precise spot where I was standing, they did not reach out to grab me. They did not utter a single word of threat or command. They did not even look at me with suspicion. Instead, in a flawless, highly choreographed military maneuver, the massive guards sharply pivoted on their heels. They instantly fanned out their broad shoulders, squaring aggressively toward Darius, Chloe, and the stunned crowd of elites. The 6 armed men locked their hands firmly in front of them, standing at rigid attention, facing outward. In a single breathtaking second, the elite security force of the Oasis, Grand Atlanta, had formed an impenetrable, highly aggressive protective perimeter directly around me. They stood like a fortress of solid muscle, treating me not as a trespasser, but as the single most important person on the entire property. The heavy silence that fell over the red carpet was absolute and suffocating. Chloe stood frozen with her arms still extended mid-air. Her brain was violently struggling to comprehend why the massive security guards were shielding me instead of dragging me away. She let out a sharp and indignant scoff, stepping forward to yell at the men in tactical gear. She aggressively demanded to know what they were doing, loudly reminding them that Darius was a very important VIP client who had paid tens of thousands of dollars to rent their ballroom. She ordered them to grab me immediately. General Manager Caldwell smoothly stepped around the solid wall of security guards. He did not look at Chloe with the deferential subservience she had grown accustomed to commanding. He looked at her with the cold and clinical detachment of a man addressing a minor pest. Caldwell stopped directly in front of me. He placed his right hand over his heart and executed a deep, highly respectful bow. It was a gesture of supreme loyalty that sent a visible shockwave ripping through the gathered crowd of Atlanta socialites. Caldwell straightened his immaculate suit and turned his sharp gaze toward Chloe. He spoke with a booming theatrical projection that ensured every single investor and media member on the red carpet heard him perfectly. He stated his apologies to Miss Chloe. He firmly declared that his security team absolutely does not remove the owner and CEO of the Oasis Hotel Group from her very own property. A collective and deafening gasp erupted from the hundreds of elite guests crowded around the velvet ropes. The wealthy investors exchanged frantic and bewildered whispers, their eyes darting rapidly between my vintage diamonds and Darius's suddenly terrified face. The blinding flash of the paparazzi cameras intensified tenfold, aggressively capturing the exact second the power dynamic completely inverted. Darius looked as though all the blood had been violently drained from his body. His custom emerald velvet tuxedo suddenly looked like a cheap, ill-fitting costume on a shrinking, pathetic man. His mouth hung open, his knees visibly buckled, forcing him to grab the brass stanchion just to remain standing. He took a weak, stumbling step forward, desperately trying to breach the security perimeter. He reached a trembling hand out toward my arm. His voice cracked with sheer disbelief as he stammered, asking Naomi if it was really true. He asked if I actually owned all of this. I did not offer him a warm smile or a comforting word. I raised my hand and swatted his trembling fingers away with the back of my wrist, brushing him off like dust. I told him never to touch me again. I looked directly into his panicked eyes and confirmed that I owned the ground he was standing on, the building he was partying in, and the very air he was currently breathing. Tasha stumbled backward, practically tripping over her own aggressive neon yellow heels. Her fake gold chains rattled against her chest as she pressed her hands to her mouth in absolute horror. The loud classist insults she had hurled at me just moments ago were now echoing mockingly in her own ears. She realized with crushing certainty that she had viciously alienated a billionaire sister-in-law who could have effortlessly funded her entire existence. Malik stood completely paralyzed near the entrance. The 16-year-old boy who had traded his mother for a video game console was now staring at a woman possessing a level of generational wealth he could not even begin to fathom. His eyes welled with tears of profound and immediate regret, but I coldly looked right past him. I had already set my boundaries, and I was not here to play mother. I was here to play the executioner. I gave a sharp, commanding nod to Chief Davis. The towering security guards instantly parted, creating a wide and unobstructed path directly through the brass doors. I did not wait for an invitation. I strode past the velvet ropes, walking straight into the grand, opulent lobby of my hotel. The entire crowd of elite investors, local politicians, and wealthy socialites naturally surged forward, eagerly following me inside. They were entirely captivated by the intoxicating drama unfolding before their eyes. Darius and Chloe were violently swept up in the current of the rushing crowd, physically forced to follow me into the very ballroom they had rented. The Crystal Ballroom was a masterpiece of luxury event design. Towering floral centerpieces decorated dozens of round tables. Waiters in crisp white uniforms circulated with silver trays of vintage champagne. Dominating the entire space were massive high-definition LED screens lining the walls. The screens were currently projecting gorgeous, hyper-realistic architectural renderings of Darius's supposed $40 million mega mansion development in the northern suburbs. The fake houses looked pristine and inviting, a perfect visual trap designed to steal millions from the eager investors standing in the room. I did not stop to mingle with the guests. I marched directly down the center aisle of the ballroom, my midnight blue, haute couture gown sweeping elegantly across the imported carpets. I climbed the short staircase onto the main stage and walked straight up to the illuminated acrylic podium. I reached out and took the microphone directly from its stand. The screech of audio feedback briefly pierced the room, silencing the frantic chatter of the crowd in an instant. Hundreds of faces turned upwards, staring at me in absolute rapt attention. I welcomed the esteemed guests to the Oasis Grand Atlanta. My voice was steady, powerful, and resonated with the unyielding authority of Great Aunt Josephine. I proudly introduced myself as Naomi, the sole heir and newly instated Chief Executive Officer of the Oasis Hotel Group. I briefly and eloquently honored the immense legacy of my great-aunt, reminding the influential Black elite in the room of the historical weight and towering prestige of the empire I now commanded. The crowd erupted into thunderous, highly respectful applause, completely validating my supreme status in their exclusive social hierarchy. I waited for the applause to die down completely. I looked down at Darius and Chloe, who were now trapped near the front of the stage, surrounded by a tight ring of my security guards. Darius was sweating profusely, frantically tugging at his tight velvet collar. Chloe was hyperventilating, her eyes darting toward the exits, but Chief Davis's men blocked every single door in the ballroom. I gripped the microphone tightly. I announced to the room that my ex-husband Darius had invited them all here tonight to celebrate his meteoric rise in the luxury real estate market. I stated that he had promised them exclusive early access to a groundbreaking $40 million commercial development. I pointed directly at the massive LED screens, displaying the gorgeous architectural renderings. I told the investors to take one final, very close look at those beautiful houses, because they were absolutely never going to be built. I reached into my designer purse and pulled out a small encrypted remote control that Sterling had configured for me. I pressed a single red button. Instantly, the gorgeous images of the mega mansions vanished from every single screen in the ballroom. The room plunged into a brief, dramatic darkness before the high-definition monitors flared back to life. The screens were now projecting the stark, undeniable reality of my forensic audit. Massive magnified images of highly confidential bank statements, routed wire transfers, and internal corporate ledgers illuminated the walls for every single guest to see. I seamlessly transitioned into my presentation, adopting the clinical and precise tone of a lead prosecutor delivering a closing argument. I systematically broke down the complex fraudulent Ponzi scheme Darius had been aggressively operating for the past 6 months. I directed the investors' attention to the glaring lack of basic commercial zoning permits in the northern suburbs. I showed them the definitive proof from the county registry, confirming that zero land deeds had ever been filed under his brokerage firm's name. I exposed the complete absence of any architectural retainers or environmental impact studies. I plainly stated that the entire mega mansion project was a desperate, calculated illusion designed to illegally extract massive cash deposits from the very people standing in this room. Angry, shocked murmurs began rippling violently through the crowd. Several prominent investors pushed their way to the front, their faces flushed with rage as they stared at the financial documents exposing their stolen money. Darius threw his hands up, shouting wildly into the crowd that the documents were completely fake and that I was just a bitter, hysterical ex-wife trying to ruin his business. I did not raise my voice to compete with his pathetic shouting. I simply pressed the button on my remote control again. The massive LED screens shifted to a new set of financial documents. These were the highly restricted client escrow accounts. I explained to the captivated audience that stealing from a protected client escrow account was not just poor business management. It was a severe career-ending federal crime. I highlighted the digital signature attached to every single unauthorized withdrawal. I pointed directly at Chloe, who was now visibly trembling and attempting to hide behind Darius's broad shoulders. I announced her name loud and clear. I detailed exactly how the 26-year-old Mistress had aggressively embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from innocent, trusting clients to fund her insatiable shopping habits. I highlighted a specific wire transfer for $82,000 to a notorious Diamond District jeweler. I told the crowd to look closely at Chloe's left hand, exposing that her massive engagement ring was paid for with their stolen investment capital. The crowd gasped in sheer horror, turning their furious glares toward the young woman. I pressed the remote again. A receipt for $2,500 flashed across the screens, completely detailing the purchase of a PS5 console and luxury gaming accessories. I looked directly at Malik, ensuring my son fully understood that the electronic bribe he had traded his mother for was purchased with dirty, stolen money. He buried his face in his hands, utterly destroyed by the public shame. Finally, I displayed the exact $75,000 non-refundable deposit receipt for the Crystal Ballroom. I informed the furious crowd of elite investors that the lavish vintage champagne they were currently drinking, the expensive caviar they were eating, and the luxurious party they were attending were all actively funded by their stolen escrow accounts. I publicly declared that Darius's real estate firm was completely insolvent, completely bankrupt, and completely built on a foundation of aggressive, unyielding lies. I held the entire room in the palm of my hand. The absolute power I wielded in that moment was intoxicating. I looked down at Darius and Chloe from my elevated stage. They were entirely trapped, stripped of their fake wealth, and permanently exposed in front of every major financial player in the city. Their arrogant reputations were completely, violently, and irrevocably annihilated. Chaos instantly erupted across the Crystal Ballroom. The elite investors, realizing their money had been stolen to fund the very party they were attending, began shouting furiously. Darius stared at the massive LED screens, his mind finally connecting the devastating dots. He realized he had not just been exposed as a massive fraud. He realized he had been entirely conned by his own 26-year-old mistress. The woman he had discarded me for had systematically drained his corporate accounts and single-handedly triggered his impending federal prison sentence. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. He lunged violently at Chloe, his hands wrapping aggressively around the collar of her sequined designer gown. He screamed at her, shaking her violently, demanding to know where his money was. Chloe shrieked in terror, desperately trying to pry his fingers off her dress, while the wealthy crowd stepped back in absolute disgust. Sterling, standing calmly at the edge of the stage, raised his hand and gave a sharp, definitive nod toward the heavy brass doors at the back of the ballroom. 4 uniformed Atlanta police officers, whom Sterling had strategically positioned in the wings just minutes before my presentation, swiftly marched into the room. They pushed through the angry crowd of investors, grabbed Darius by the shoulders, and forcefully ripped him away from Chloe. 2 officers pinned Darius against a catering table to subdue his violent outburst. The other 2 officers immediately grabbed Chloe's wrists, slamming heavy steel handcuffs over them. The sharp metallic click echoed through the room as the lead officer loudly read her Miranda rights, officially placing her under arrest for felony embezzlement and grand larceny. Darius stopped struggling against the officers. The sheer crushing weight of his absolute failure finally shattered his towering ego. He looked up at me, standing powerfully on the stage. In that singular moment, the terrifying reality of the fast-track divorce he had so aggressively forced upon me hit him like a physical blow. He realized that to protect his imaginary $40 million commission, he had legally permanently locked himself out of my $55 million empire. He fell heavily to his knees right there on the imported carpet. He ignored the flashing cameras and the furious glares of his former colleagues. He shamelessly begged me for mercy. He pleaded with me to use my massive wealth to pay off the angry investors and bail his bankrupt firm out of the millions in debt Chloe had created. He desperately promised that we could fix our marriage and build a true legacy together. Tasha pushed her way to the front of the crowd, tears streaming rapidly down her face. Her fake gold chains rattled as she clasped her hands together in a pathetic display of prayer. She cried loudly, suddenly calling me her beloved sister, begging me not to let the police take her brother away. I looked down at the two of them, feeling absolutely nothing but cold clinical detachment. I did not offer a single ounce of forgiveness or sympathy. I leaned into the microphone and spoke with absolute ice. I told them that, like Chloe said, there is no place here for the useless. I signaled Chief Davis, and the security team aggressively cleared the ballroom, handing my ex-husband and his mistress directly over to the federal authorities. The fallout was swift and completely merciless. Within a few short days, Darius's fraudulent brokerage firm was permanently shuttered by federal regulators. The bank immediately foreclosed on the sprawling Buckhead estate he had proudly claimed as his own. The promised luxury Tesla vanished into thin air, and Darius was denied bail while awaiting trial for massive corporate fraud. Exactly 1 week after the gala, I received an alert from the security team at my newly purchased multi-million-dollar private estate. I walked out to the massive wrought iron front gates to find Malik standing on the sidewalk. He was dragging a single beat-up suitcase. He was crying heavily, his previous teenage arrogance entirely stripped away by the harsh, unforgiving reality of his father's sudden poverty. He begged me to let him move into the mansion. He pleaded for a second chance, claiming he had made a terrible mistake by trusting his father and Chloe. My heart ached deeply for my son, but my maternal love would not allow me to enable his toxic materialistic entitlement. I looked at him through the thick iron bars of the gate. I did not open it. I kept my voice incredibly firm, completely devoid of any weakness. I told Malik that I loved him unconditionally, but I refused to let him bring his father's corrupt values into my peaceful home. I informed him that I had already paid his full tuition for a highly strict, disciplined out-of-state boarding school. The car waiting down the street was there to take him directly to the airport. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered my final unyielding boundary. I told him, you chose materials over your mother. You won't step foot in my home until you learn what family actually means. I watched the driver load his suitcase and drive him away, knowing the tough love I administered today was the only thing that could truly save his character tomorrow. I turned my back on the gate and walked slowly up the long, manicured driveway toward my beautiful, peaceful estate. Later that evening, I stood alone on the expansive balcony of my penthouse suite, looking out over the glittering Atlanta skyline. The city lights sparkled brilliantly against the dark night sky. I took a deep breath of the crisp air, feeling a profound, untouchable sense of tranquility. I had successfully shed a toxic marriage, crushed an arrogant betrayal, and reclaimed my absolute power. I realized that true peace does not come from endlessly accommodating the people who disrespect you. True peace comes from establishing absolute ironclad boundaries and maintaining an unyielding sense of self-worth. I had built a fortress around my heart and my empire, and I was finally entirely free. Have you ever had to use cold hard facts to crush a betrayer's ego? Let me know in the comments below.